In the long silence of early medieval Europe, before borders hardened and before history learned how to write itself neatly, there were whispers. Not the kind that announce themselves loudly, but the kind that linger, carried through monasteries, half-remembered in village songs, embedded in the margins of forgotten chronicles. These whispers spoke of kings whose authority did not come merely from conquest or coronation, but from blood itself. Blood believed to be ancient, sacred, and dangerous. Blood that could not simply be replaced. Imagine the landscape of Europe after the fall of Rome. Great stone cities still stood, but their meaning had collapsed. Roads cracked, laws faded. The imperial voice that once unified millions had gone silent, leaving behind a vacuum filled with fear, ambition, and longing. In this uncertain world, power was fragile. Anyone could claim a crown, but few could make others believe in it. And belief, more than armies, was the true currency of rule. It is here, in this liminal space between civilization and chaos, that the Merovingians emerge, not fully formed, not clearly defined, but already wrapped in mystery. They do not stride onto the stage of history like later dynasties, announcing their greatness with manifestos and monuments. Instead, they seem to rise from the mist, as if remembered rather than recorded. Their origins are unclear. Their earliest ancestors are barely visible. And yet, within a few generations, they rule much of what will become France, Germany, and beyond. From the very beginning, something about them feels different. Chroniclers do not describe the Merovingians as ordinary kings. They speak instead of signs and symbols, of sacred hair that must never be cut, of queens whose wombs carried political destiny, of ancestors who may not have been entirely human. These are not casual details. In a world where history was written sparingly and parchment was precious, such stories were preserved for a reason. They mattered to those who told them, and perhaps they frightened those who later tried to erase them. To understand why the Merovingians inspire such fascination, even today, we must first understand the fear and wonder of the age that produced them. This was not a rational, bureaucratic world. It was a world where the boundary between myth and memory was thin, where divine favor could manifest in victory, lineage, or physical signs upon the body. Kings were not just rulers. They were vessels, living symbols that connected the human realm to something older and unseen. The Merovingians, more than any other European dynasty, embodied this idea. Later generations would call them the first kings of France. But this title flattens their strangeness. It makes them sound familiar, safe, understandable. They were none of these things. Their authority rested not on institutions, those barely existed, but on a belief that their blood carried something essential. Something that could not be taught, elected, or seized, only inherited. And this belief had consequences, because when power is rooted in blood, removing a king is not enough. You must neutralize the lineage itself. You must discredit it, rewrite it, or push it into silence. Otherwise, it remains a threat, sleeping but alive. A shadow claim waiting to reemerge when conditions are right. This is why the Merovingians did not simply fade away like so many early dynasties. Their end feels unfinished, abrupt, ritualistic, almost surgical. Their last kings were not executed in grand spectacles. They were tonsured, shaved of their sacred hair, and sent into monasteries, stripped not only of power, but of identity. As if someone understood that killing the body was unnecessary so long as the symbol was destroyed. Yet symbols are resilient. Even after their fall, rumors persisted that the Merovingian bloodline survived, that it was hidden among monks, peasants, or distant nobles, that the church itself felt uneasy about what it had helped suppress, and that certain stories, too strange, too destabilizing, were quietly set aside, neither confirmed nor fully denied. Centuries later, these rumors would resurface in unexpected places, in medieval legends, in coded genealogies, in modern conspiracy theories that connect the Merovingians to sacred bloodlines, lost heirs, and even figures at the very heart of Christianity. Many of these claims are speculative, some deeply flawed, but their persistence tells us something important. People sense that there is a gap in the story, a silence where something once was. This documentary does not begin with the promise of secret societies or hidden treasure. It begins with a simpler, more unsettling question. Why does this dynasty, more than 1,000 years later, still refuse to rest quietly in the past? Perhaps because the Merovingians represent an idea that modern history struggles to contain, the idea that power was once mystical, embodied, and inherited in ways that cannot be fully explained by politics alone. An idea that kings were not made by law, but born into something older than law. And that when such an idea becomes inconvenient, history does not argue with it. It buries it. As we move deeper into the story, we will strip away layers of legend and propaganda, not to debunk the mystery, but to understand it. We will walk through battlefields and baptismal fonts, royal beds and monastery cells. We will meet queens who shaped empires and kings who were reduced to silence. And we will see how one of Europe's most influential bloodlines was transformed, from sacred rulers into footnotes. But for now, let us remain in the quiet at the beginning, in the moment before the names harden and the dates accumulate, in a Europe that is listening, waiting, unsure of what kind of kings it needs. Because somewhere in that silence, the Merovingians are already there, watching history form around them, carrying a legacy that will one day be called lost. And the question that follows us from the very first whisper is this: what kind of power must a dynasty possess for the world to decide it is safer to forget it than to remember it? When Rome fell, it did not collapse in a single night of fire and screams. Faded, authority thinned, roads emptied, and laws that once bound continents together became little more than echoes. By the 5th century, Western Europe was no longer governed by emperors whose faces were stamped on coins. It was governed by absence, and into that absence poured uncertainty, ambition, and fear. For the people living in former Roman provinces, the end of empire was not experienced as a grand historical turning point. It was experienced as confusion. Tax collectors stopped arriving. Soldiers no longer protected the roads. Courts fell silent. Old titles remained, but their meaning had drained away. Roman order had promised predictability. What followed offered only survival. This was the world before the Franks had kings. Across Gaul, Germania, and the Rhine frontier, communities were forced to adapt quickly. Power no longer flowed from distant capitals. It became local, personal, and often violent. A man with armed followers mattered more than a written decree. Loyalty was not sworn to an abstract state, but to individuals who could offer protection. In such a world, leadership had to be visible. It had to be felt. Yet brute force alone was not enough. Many warlords rose in this period, but few endured. What separated those who vanished from those who founded dynasties was legitimacy. People needed to believe that a ruler had the right to command, not just the strength to do so. And without Roman law or imperial tradition to fall back on, legitimacy had to come from somewhere else. It came from the past. Germanic tribes did not see history as a sequence of dates and events. They saw it as ancestry. Memory was carried in bloodlines, songs, and stories told beside fires. A leader was not simply chosen for skill in battle. He was measured by who his ancestors were believed to be, and what signs surrounded his birth and life. To rule was to stand at the visible tip of an invisible lineage. This made ancestry sacred. In the absence of written law, genealogy became authority. To claim descent from a revered forefather, real or legendary, was to claim the loyalty of those who remembered that name. The further back the lineage stretched, the stronger the claim became. Time itself granted power. It is important to understand this, because modern eyes often underestimate how deeply people believed in the past as a living force. The dead were not gone. They lingered in memory, in land, in blood. To rule without ancestral legitimacy was to rule on borrowed time. Roman culture had once offered a different kind of legitimacy. Citizenship, law, and imperial appointment created authority that did not depend on blood. But when that system unraveled, its replacement was not chaos, it was tradition. Older, deeper, and more emotional than any bureaucracy. In Gaul, this transition created a strange hybrid world. Roman villas still stood beside Germanic longhouses. Latin was spoken in courts, while tribal customs governed daily life. Bishops inherited the moral authority of Roman officials, while warriors inherited the practical authority of soldiers. Everything overlapped. Nothing was settled. It was within this unstable landscape that the Franks emerged. They were not a single, unified people at first. They were a loose confederation of tribes living along the Rhine frontier, some long settled within Roman territory, others still moving. Rome had once employed them as allies, granting land in exchange for military service. Over time, these arrangements blurred the line between Roman and barbarian, citizen and outsider. When Rome withdrew, the Franks did not invade a vacuum. They stepped into a role they had been rehearsing for generations. But they faced the same problem as every other group in post-Roman Europe: how to turn force into permanence. The earliest Frankish leaders were war chiefs, not kings. Their authority lasted only as long as their success. Defeat meant replacement. There was no crown to inherit, no throne to protect. Power was personal and temporary. This made large-scale stability impossible. What the Franks needed was something more than warriors. They needed a lineage that could outlive any single man. This is why the emergence of a royal family mattered so profoundly. A dynasty transformed leadership from an event into an institution. It created continuity where none existed. And in a world terrified of instability, continuity felt like salvation. Yet declaring oneself a king was not enough. Titles had lost their meaning with Rome. What mattered was whether people believed the claim. And belief once again returned to blood. The Merovingians did not arise simply because they were stronger or more clever than their rivals. They arose because they offered something this fractured world desperately wanted: a sense that power was not random, that it flowed from a source older than the chaos, that the future was anchored to the past. Even before the name Merovingian was spoken, the conditions for their rise were already in place. A society exhausted by uncertainty, a population willing to accept myth as reassurance, and a belief system that saw lineage not as coincidence but as destiny. This helps explain why later chroniclers were so eager to surround the dynasty's origins with legend. These stories were not embellishments added centuries later for entertainment. They were foundational. They told people why these rulers deserved loyalty when no written law could enforce it. And they also explain why, once such a bloodline was established, it became so dangerous to remove. In a world governed by belief, overthrowing a king did not erase his authority. It transferred it. His blood remained, carrying the same invisible claim. As long as descendants lived, the past could return. This fear haunted early medieval politics. It is why rival claimants were blinded, tonsured, or sent into monasteries rather than killed. Death could make a martyr. Survival, stripped of symbols, could neutralize a threat. The Merovingians would later become masters of this symbolic world. But they did not invent it. They inherited it from a Europe already primed to believe that kings were not merely chosen. They were born. As we move forward, the stage is now set. The empire is gone. The old order has collapsed. The people are waiting not for law but for meaning. And into this waiting world, a lineage will soon step forward, one that claims not just the right to rule, but the right to be remembered. The question is no longer whether Europe needed kings. It is what kind of kings it was willing to believe in. Every dynasty begins with a story. Not a date, not a document, but a story. Something that explains why this family, above all others, was chosen to rule. In the case of the Merovingians, that story does not begin on land. It begins at the water's edge. One of the earliest sources to mention the origins of the Merovingian line records something strange, even unsettling. It speaks of a queen who, while bathing in the sea, encountered a mysterious being. Not a man in the ordinary sense, but something older, more ambiguous. The chronicler struggles to describe it, calling it a quinator, a beast of the sea, half known and half feared. From this encounter, the text suggests, a child was conceived, Merovec, the ancestor from whom the dynasty would take its name. To modern readers, this sounds like mythology. a fragment of pagan imagination surviving in a Christian chronicle. And it is tempting to dismiss it as such. But doing so too quickly misses the point. The question is not whether this story is literally true. The question is why it was preserved at all. By the time this account was written down, the Franks were already Christian. Their historians were monks, trained to reject pagan superstition. And yet, instead of removing this story, they included it, awkwardly, cautiously, but deliberately. This suggests that the legend carried weight. It was not easily erased, even by those who might have preferred a cleaner origin. In the early medieval mind, origin stories were not measured by factual accuracy. They were measured by meaning. To claim descent from the sea was to claim something profound. The sea represented chaos, creation, and the unknown. It was both feared and revered. Roman writers had long associated the ocean with the edges of the world, where monsters and gods still lingered. To emerge from the sea was to arrive from beyond the ordinary human realm. Many ancient cultures traced royal bloodlines to gods, heroes, or supernatural unions. The Franks were no different. What makes the Merovingian legend unusual is its tone. It is not triumphant. It is ambiguous, even uncomfortable. The chronicler does not celebrate the encounter. He records it, almost reluctantly, as if acknowledging something that cannot be undone. This discomfort is important. It suggests that the story was not invented by Christian writers seeking to glorify the dynasty. Instead, it was inherited, an older tradition carried forward despite its incompatibility with new beliefs. In this sense, the legend functions like a fossil, preserving traces of a pre-Christian worldview embedded within a later narrative. To the people who first told this story, the implication would have been clear. The Merovingian line was not entirely human. Or rather, it was human touched by something else, something that placed it apart. This belief would later manifest in physical symbols. The most famous of these was the long hair of Merovingian kings. Hair, in many ancient cultures, was associated with vitality, strength, and sacred power. Cutting it was not merely cosmetic, it was transformative. In the Merovingian context, hair became the visible marker of invisible ancestry. The Seaborn legend helps explain why. If the dynasty's power flowed from a supernatural origin, then the body itself became sacred. The king was not just a ruler. He was a vessel of inherited force. His appearance mattered because it signaled his connection to that force. Long hair was not fashion. It was proof. And proof mattered in a world where few things were written and even fewer were certain. The legend also served a political function. By placing the dynasty's origin outside ordinary human society, it removed it from competition. A rival warlord could claim descent from a famous ancestor. He could boast of victories, but he could not easily claim a supernatural conception without inviting ridicule or disbelief. The Merovingians' origin story was strange enough to be unrepeatable, and that made it powerful. Yet there is another layer to this legend, one often overlooked. The chronicler states that it was unclear whether Merovec was the son of the king or of the sea creature. This ambiguity is not resolved. Both possibilities are left standing. In modern storytelling, this would be considered sloppy. In early medieval storytelling, it was deliberate. Ambiguity creates flexibility. It allows belief to adapt. Those who were uncomfortable with pagan implications could emphasize the human father. Those drawn to older traditions could lean into the supernatural. The story could survive religious transition because it did not force a single interpretation. It hovered in between, like the world it described. This in-between quality defines much of Merovingian identity. They ruled in a time when Europe itself was suspended between eras, between Rome and Christendom, between pagan memory and Christian doctrine. Their origin story reflects that tension perfectly. It is also worth noting that the sea, in this context, may not refer only to the literal ocean. Some scholars suggest it could symbolize foreignness, otherness, or even migration. The Franks themselves were once outsiders to Roman Gaul. To be from the sea was to come from beyond the known order. In that sense, the legend encodes historical memory in symbolic form. But symbols have a way of becoming literal when belief is strong enough. For the Merovingians' followers, this story reinforced the idea that their rulers were chosen by forces beyond human control. This made rebellion not just risky, but sacrilegious. To oppose such a king was to oppose the order of the world itself. And yet, the very thing that made this legend powerful would later make it dangerous. As Christianity consolidated its authority, stories of supernatural ancestry became problematic. Power was meant to flow from God through the church, not through blood touched by ambiguous forces. The Merovingians' origin myth, once a source of legitimacy, became a liability. It could not be openly condemned without undermining the dynasty's past. But it could be quietly sidelined, reinterpreted, allowed to fade. Still, it never fully disappeared. The fact that we are discussing it now, more than 1,000 years later, is evidence of its resilience. It survived not because it was true in a literal sense, but because it expressed something essential about how power was understood at the dawn of medieval Europe. The Merovingians were not merely claiming descent from a creature of the sea. They were claiming descent from mystery itself. From a time before records, before law, before certainty. They were anchoring their rule in the deep past, where origins could not be easily challenged. As the dynasty grows more visible in history, their beginnings will recede further into legend. Names will replace myths. Battles will replace symbols. But this strange, sea-born story remains at the foundation, quietly shaping everything that follows. Because once a dynasty defines itself as more than human, its fall can never be ordinary. And long after its kings are gone, people will continue to ask whether something of that otherness still lingers. Hidden, diluted, but alive, somewhere beneath the surface of European history. Merovingian stands at the edge of history like a figure half seen through fog. He is not fully present, yet he cannot be ignored. His name gives the Merovingian dynasty its identity, and yet almost nothing certain is known about him. No clear birth date, no detailed record of his reign, no definitive account of his death. What remains instead are fragments, mentions in chronicles, hints in genealogies, and the persistent sense that something important has been deliberately left unsaid. This absence is not accidental. Early medieval writers were capable of recording detail when they wished to. Battles, treaties, miracles, and scandals were all carefully noted when they served a purpose. The silence surrounding Merovingian suggests not ignorance, but uncertainty, or perhaps caution. He belonged to a time when memory was still fluid, when stories had not yet hardened into official history. The earliest texts describe Merovingian as a leader of the Franks in the mid-5th century, during the final decades of Roman influence in Gaul. This was a violent and unstable period. Roman generals still fought to maintain control, while emerging Frankish leaders tested their strength along the northern frontiers. Loyalties shifted quickly. Alliances were temporary. Survival depended on adaptability. In this chaos, Merovingian appears not as a conqueror of cities, but as a figure of continuity. He represents a bridge between tribal leadership and dynastic kingship. Before him, Frankish leaders rose and fell with their fortunes. After him, leadership begins to attach itself to a family, not just a man. But even this role is blurred. Some sources suggest Merovingian fought alongside Roman forces, perhaps even serving as an ally to imperial generals like Aetius. If true, this would place him within the long tradition of barbarian leaders operating inside the Roman system. Others imply he acted independently, carving out authority in a world where Rome's grip was weakening. The contradiction is never resolved, and perhaps it was never meant to be. Merovingian exists in the historical record more as a reference point than as a personality. Later kings trace their lineage to him not because his life was well known, but because his name carried weight. It was old. It was associated with legitimacy. And crucially, it was already wrapped in legend. This is where the myth of the sea-born ancestor becomes especially significant. If Merovingian was believed to be the product of a supernatural encounter, then his very existence blurred the line between history and myth. He did not need to be remembered clearly. His power lay in what he represented, not in what he did. In early medieval thought, this was enough. Names mattered. To be named as an ancestor was to be made real regardless of documentation. The act of remembering created truth. By invoking Merovec, later Merovingian kings were not making a factual claim so much as a symbolic one. They were anchoring themselves to a sacred beginning. This explains why Merovec is rarely described acting as a king in the later sense. There is no capital city associated with him, no law code bearing his name, no monumental building to mark his rule. These were not yet the markers of authority. His authority was genealogical. He was important because others said he was. And this raises an unsettling possibility, that Merovec was less an individual ruler and more a constructed ancestor, a figure shaped by memory to serve the needs of those who came after. This does not mean he did not exist. It means that the Merovec we encounter in history is already filtered through purpose. If this is true, then the Merovingian dynasty did something remarkably sophisticated for its time. It did not merely rule by force. It ruled by narrative. By establishing a semi-mythical founder, the dynasty insulated itself from scrutiny. Rivals could challenge a living king. They could not easily challenge a legend. To question Merovec was to question the foundation of authority itself. At the same time, this strategy carried risk. Legends invite interpretation, and interpretations can change. As Christianity spread and literacy increased, chroniclers became more interested in order, clarity, and moral coherence. Ambiguous figures like Merovec became problematic. His unclear origins, his possible supernatural conception, and his lack of clear Christian identity made him difficult to integrate into a new historical framework. Yet again, he was not removed. He was retained, minimized, but present. This pattern repeats throughout Merovingian history. Elements that no longer fit are not destroyed. They are softened, blurred, allowed to fade into the background. Silence becomes a tool. The name Merovec survives primarily because it was necessary. Without him, the dynasty loses its anchor. But the less said about him, the safer the story becomes. There is also a deeper cultural reason for his obscurity. In many early societies, founders were intentionally left vague. Precision limited their symbolic power. A figure with too many details could be questioned, contradicted, localized. A figure half-hidden could belong to everyone. Merovec belongs to that tradition. He stands not as a man with a biography, but as a threshold. Before him, leadership is fluid and temporary. After him, it becomes hereditary. Whether or not he consciously initiated this shift is almost irrelevant. What matters is that later generations believed he did. And belief creates reality. This is why Merovec's shadow looms larger than his actions. He is the point at which Frankish leadership transforms into something resembling kingship. Not because he wore a crown, but because his name endured. His son or grandson, depending on the source, would be Childeric I, a figure far better documented. With Childeric, archaeology enters the picture. Tombs are found. Artifacts emerge. The dynasty begins to leave physical traces. But Childeric's authority depends on Merovec. Without that ancestral link, he is just another war leader. With it, he becomes something more, the bearer of a lineage. This is the moment where myth hardens into structure. The Merovingians did not invent kingship in Europe, but they were among the first to give it a hereditary, quasi-sacred form that could survive individual failure. That innovation begins here, in the mist around Merovec. And as we move forward, the question is no longer whether Merovec was real in the modern sense. The question is whether his carefully preserved obscurity was the very thing that allowed his descendants to rule, and whether that same obscurity would later make it easier for others to erase them from memory. Because what is not clearly seen is often easiest to remove. Yet it is also the hardest to forget. Clovis I. The name still resonates across the centuries, whispered in the margins of history books, in tales told beside fires, in the echo of crowns long vanished. Unlike his shadowy ancestor Merovec, Clovis steps fully into the light of recorded history. He is a man of ambition, of violence, and of extraordinary cunning. Yet to understand Clovis, one must first understand the world he inherited. A fractured, uncertain Europe where might and belief were inseparable, and where the question of legitimacy could mean life or death. Born in the middle of the 5th century, Clovis was not predestined to dominate Gaul. His kingdom, that of the Salian Franks, was one of many tribal territories, each ruled by war chiefs whose power ebbed and flowed like the tides. Rival factions constantly vied for control. Even within his family, ambition simmered. Brothers and cousins were competitors as much as kin, and alliances were fleeting. Survival required both the sword and the skill to navigate human loyalties. Clovis' rise began in this precarious landscape. Early campaigns were marked by both courage and calculation. He fought not merely to expand territory, but to consolidate influence over other Frankish tribes. Unlike leaders who relied solely on brute force, Clovis understood that war alone could not guarantee enduring authority. Victory was necessary, yes, but legitimacy required more, a claim that others would recognize and respect, not just fear. It was at this intersection of power and belief that religion entered his story. Before Clovis, the Franks practiced a mixture of pagan rites, ancestor veneration, and localized spiritual customs. These were potent, deeply emotional systems, yet they lacked the unifying power of a singular faith. Clovis' conversion to Christianity in the late 490s was therefore a turning point, not only for him personally, but for the future of Europe. The moment of Clovis' baptism is enveloped in both legend and political symbolism. Accounts tell of his hesitation, his doubts, his fear of abandoning the gods who had guided his ancestors. Yet the decision was also strategic. By embracing Catholic Christianity, Clovis aligned himself with a powerful religious institution and, importantly, with the Roman population of Gaul. In doing so, he transformed himself from a tribal war chief into a ruler whose authority was sanctified in the eyes of both God and his subjects. The baptism itself was dramatic. Some chroniclers describe the pouring of holy water as an almost transformative act, linking Clovis not just to the Christian God but to a broader sense of divine destiny. From that moment, Clovis was no longer simply a man of ambition. He became a vessel of sacred purpose. His victories in battle could be interpreted as evidence of divine favor, his decisions as expressions of a higher will. To challenge him was implicitly to challenge God. And yet, conversion was not the end of struggle, it was the beginning of a new strategy. Clovis wielded faith as a weapon. Military campaigns were framed as righteous crusades against pagans and heretics alike. Diplomacy was enhanced by the sanctity of his position. And within his own family and tribe, his new status discouraged internal rebellion. The combination of charisma, military skill, and religious authority made Clovis uniquely formidable. The unification of the Frankish tribes under Clovis' leadership was unprecedented. By the end of his life, he had expanded his dominion across much of modern France and parts of Western Germany. Cities that had once been Roman strongholds fell into his hands. Former allies became subjects. Even the remnants of Roman authority were absorbed, not through bureaucracy, but through the careful projection of legitimacy. Every conquest, every alliance, every marriage, each action reinforced the notion that Clovis' rule was not temporary, but ordained. Marriage, in particular, was a tool of power. Clovis married Clotilde, a Burgundian princess and devout Christian, whose influence on him was profound. Their union was political, yes, but also symbolic, a bridge between tribes, faiths, and generations. Clotilde's role in encouraging Clovis' baptism illustrates the interplay of human agency and divine narrative in consolidating power. She became not merely a queen, but a living embodiment of strategic and spiritual counsel. Even victories over other tribes carried an element of psychological warfare. The Battle of Tolbiac, fought against the Alemanni, is remembered not simply for its military significance, but for the personal stakes Clovis placed on the outcome. Tradition recounts that, in a moment of desperation, he vowed to convert to Christianity if granted victory. The promise, whether literal or legendary, fused ambition with faith, cementing the pattern that would define his reign. Success legitimized by divine sanction. But Clovis' path was not linear, nor was it free from moral ambiguity. Chronicles record acts of brutality, betrayals, and calculated cruelty. Rivals and family members alike were executed or marginalized. Cities were sacked. Entire populations were subjugated. Yet these actions, when framed within the context of divine purpose, were transformed from mere violence into instruments of destiny. The line between sacred duty and ruthless ambition blurred, creating a narrative in which Clovis was both mortal and mythic. The transformation of Clovis from tribal chief to Christian king had consequences that would ripple for centuries. His dynasty, the Merovingians, was now entwined with the church in a symbiotic relationship. Kings conferred protection and patronage, while the church granted legitimacy and moral authority. This model would shape European monarchy for generations, embedding the idea that divine favor could validate temporal power. Yet there was a paradox at the heart of Clovis' reign. Conversion and conquest amplified his authority, but they also exposed the dynasty to new vulnerabilities. By relying on the church, he introduced a competing source of power, an institution capable of both elevating and restraining kings. Alliances forged with faith required constant maintenance, and the very sanctity that strengthened him could, in later generations, be wielded against his heirs. Even so, during Clovis' lifetime, the convergence of military genius, political strategy, and religious symbolism made him nearly invincible. He demonstrated that rulership in early medieval Europe was never just about armies or titles. It was about perception, narrative, and the ability to inhabit a role larger than oneself. He was a king by force, by lineage, and by divine recognition, a combination so rare that it seems almost engineered by fate. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis had accomplished something few rulers before him could claim. He had transformed a collection of restless tribes into a unified kingdom. He had forged a new relationship between monarchy and religion, and he had created a model of power that would define the Merovingian dynasty for generations, long after his body had returned to dust. Yet the story does not end with Clovis. The very measures he took to secure his rule, the sanctification of blood, the intertwining of faith and authority, the elevation of legend over individual action, would create tensions for his descendants. Sacred hair, symbolic ancestry, and dynastic intrigue would become both protection and curse. The dynasty he built on faith and conquest would eventually face rivals who sought to erase its memory. And that is the essential paradox of Clovis' legacy. He succeeded in making his family indispensable to the story of Europe, yet the very tools that secured that indispensability, the myths, the sanctity, the narratives of divine favor, would also make them vulnerable to being quietly undone. For now, however, Clovis stands at the peak of his power, a man whose ambition, faith, and cunning reshaped Europe. He is a king of action and myth alike, whose baptism, victories, and alliances laid the foundation not just for a dynasty, but for an entirely new conception of kingship. The world of the Merovingians begins here, with a man who understood that ruling was not simply a matter of force, but of vision, narrative, and the audacity to intertwine destiny with blood. It is in Clovis that the Merovingians truly come alive, stepping from the haze of legend into the glare of history. And yet, as we will see in the generations that follow, even this brilliance will be tested, diluted, and ultimately overshadowed by forces both internal and external, leaving a dynasty whose story is as mysterious as it is remarkable. One of the most striking and unusual symbols of Merovingian power was something that seems almost trivial to the modern eye: hair. Yet for these early Frankish kings, long hair was not a fashion statement. It was a tangible expression of authority, a visible marker of sacred lineage, and, in many ways, the very essence of what it meant to be a Merovingian. To cut the hair of a king was to strip him of power. To shave it was to end his reign without spilling a drop of blood. In this society, hair was not merely personal. It was political, religious, and symbolic all at once. The association of hair with authority has deep roots. Across Europe and beyond, long hair was often linked to vitality, strength, and spiritual potency. From the Celtic warriors whose flowing locks inspired fear in their enemies, to biblical figures like Samson whose hair was the vessel of divine strength, hair carried meaning far beyond mere aesthetics. Among the Merovingians, this symbolism was amplified. codified into the very identity of kingship. Merovingian kings were born into power, yes, but their authority needed to be seen. Long, uncut hair functioned as a public, visual reminder of their sacred status. It distinguished them immediately from ordinary men and even from lesser nobles. In a world where literacy was rare, where chronicles were confined to monasteries, and where memory was as much a tool of governance as law, symbols like hair communicated in a language everyone could understand. The longer the hair, the clearer the evidence. This man carries the blood of Merovec, the divine ancestry, and the right to rule. The ritual of hair was also intertwined with life cycles and political transitions. When a Merovingian king died, the ceremonial cutting of his hair, often accompanied by burial, signified the end of his sacred authority. But in life, the hair was untouchable. Rivals might conquer his lands, but the king could not be fully dethroned unless his hair was shorn. This subtle yet powerful rule transformed a simple act into a political instrument. Hair became a kind of living crown, one that could not be forged, stolen, or faked. But why hair? Why not crown, scepter, or seal? The answer lies in the Merovingians' understanding of power as something embodied, mystical, and inherited. Crowns and scepters could be passed, stolen, or claimed by usurpers. But blood, once sanctified through lineage, was immutable. Hair, growing directly from the body, became the visible extension of that unbroken line. It was proof that the sacred force of the dynasty still flowed through living flesh. This connection between hair and authority also reinforced social hierarchies in subtle ways. Observers could tell at a glance who possessed the divine right to rule. Long hair marked kings. Short hair, commoners. Shorn hair, fallen rulers or those who had been deliberately neutralized. In a largely illiterate society, such visual markers were crucial for maintaining order. Power had to be visible or it risked being questioned, contested, or ignored. At the same time, hair became a tool of control and suppression. When the last Merovingian kings, the so-called Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings, were removed from power, their hair was cut as part of the ritual of deposition. Stripped of the symbol, they were no longer kings, even if they were still alive. Some were sent to monasteries, others quietly exiled. In a single act, the dynasty neutralized potential threats without creating martyrs or blood feuds. The sacred bond was broken, leaving the person alive but powerless. This ritualistic use of hair reflects a broader theme in Merovingian society: the intertwining of the physical and the symbolic. Authority was not just about what a king could command with armies or decrees. It was about the perception of sanctity, about the way belief could be anchored in tangible human forms. In the Merovingian worldview, sacred power could manifest in a body, in a gesture, in a lock of hair. To understand this is to understand how the dynasty maintained legitimacy for centuries, often without the trappings of centralized administration or written law. Queens, too, played a role in maintaining the sacred symbolism of hair. Royal women were expected to uphold the sanctity of the bloodline through marriage, childbirth, and personal example. Their own appearance, including hair, became part of the visual language of power, reinforcing the idea that rulership was inherited and embodied rather than simply assumed. The dynasty's mystical authority was therefore maintained not only through kings, but through the careful orchestration of the entire royal household. The importance of hair also carried a psychological dimension. For subjects, seeing a king with long, flowing locks was a daily reminder of continuity and stability. It reinforced faith in the dynasty, in the sacredness of rulership, and in the notion that the line of Merovec was eternal. The symbolism was so pervasive that it shaped how chroniclers wrote, how rivals plotted, and how ordinary people oriented themselves within society. Hair was a silent language, understood by everyone yet interpretable only within the context of dynastic ideology. Even today, the image of long-haired Merovingian kings evokes something otherworldly, almost alien. Modern observers are fascinated by it, seeing in it a blend of ritual, mysticism, and raw human ambition. But in their own time, this symbolism was practical, functional, and deeply political. It was the glue that held a fragile kingdom together, the visible proof that a man was more than flesh and bone, that he carried within him the weight of divine ancestry. There is also a deeper lesson in this seemingly simple tradition. In a world without newspapers, social media, or standardized legal codes, symbols were more powerful than written edicts. Authority had to be seen, understood, and believed. Hair, in its growing, untouchable, sacred form, communicated something words could not. It bridged the gap between human perception and divine ordination, between myth and governance, between memory and power. In this sense, the long hair of the Merovingians is more than a curiosity. It is a key to understanding their society. It embodies the fusion of legend and history, the intersection of personal identity and political authority, and the way in which a dynasty could survive not only through conquest but through perception. And yet, the very thing that made their hair powerful also made it vulnerable. Symbolism can be neutralized, rituals can be manipulated, and belief can be redirected. As we will see in later sections, this sacred marker becomes both a lifeline and a trap. Kings can be dethroned without a single sword being drawn. Bloodlines can be erased symbolically, even when descendants survive. Authority, so intricately tied to a physical feature, is fragile in unexpected ways. For now, however, in the era of Clovis and his immediate successors, long hair remains a visible, awe-inspiring emblem. It signals sacred blood, divine favor, and the continuity of a dynasty that rules not only by force, but by belief. In a Europe still reeling from the collapse of Rome, this simple yet profound symbol reassures subjects, commands respect, and shapes the perception of kingship itself. Long hair, in the world of the Merovingians, is not vanity. It is power. It is identity. It is survival. It is the visible line that connects mortal men to myth, history to destiny, and the ephemeral present to the eternal past. It is a symbol that, for a fleeting yet remarkable era, defined what it meant to be king. And it is a symbol that will, centuries later, continue to capture our imagination, hinting at a world where authority was not written, but grown, lived, and seen in the most human and most extraordinary form. The power of the Merovingians was not merely inherited through the sword or the subtle magic of long hair. It was encoded in blood, marriage, and the carefully orchestrated passage of lineage. In early medieval Europe, political authority was inseparable from family ties. To rule effectively, a king needed not only sons who could inherit his realm but also marriages that could expand influence, forge alliances, and secure loyalty. Blood was both weapon and shield. It was the currency of power, the measure of legitimacy, and the foundation upon which the Merovingians built their dynasty. The emphasis on lineage was not a novelty, but a necessity. In a world where laws were fluid and armies could turn on their commanders, heritage was the only form of stability. To claim descent from Merovec or to be recognized as his legitimate heir was to claim a link to divine favor itself. The notion that authority was inherited through blood created a rigid hierarchy in which kings were sacred by birth, not simply by conquest. Every marriage, every child, every union became a statement of continuity, a deliberate investment in the dynasty's future. Queens, in this system, were far more than ceremonial figures. They were political architects, spiritual guides, and guardians of dynastic legitimacy. Through marriage, they secured alliances that could prevent rebellion, strengthen borders, and integrate rival factions into the royal fold. Through childbirth, they carried the future of the kingdom in their wombs. The success of a queen was measured not merely by her influence in courtly matters but by her ability to produce heirs who could perpetuate the sacred bloodline. In essence, the women of the Merovingian dynasty were as central to its survival as the kings themselves. The Merovingians also practiced a form of internal family strategy that modern observers might find ruthless. Siblings, cousins, and uncles were often allocated territories or titles, not out of generosity, but as a means of consolidating control. Yet this very practice carried risk. Dividing the realm among heirs could weaken the central authority, invite conflict, and spur internecine wars. The dynasty walked a delicate balance. Enough distribution to appease ambitious relatives, but not so much that the kingdom fractured beyond repair. Blood and marriage intertwined with myth. The sacred origin of the Merovingian line, the sea-born ancestor, the divine touch in their veins, imbued every union with significance. A Merovingian heir was not simply a child. He or she was a vessel of history and destiny. To marry into this line was to gain more than land or prestige. It was to touch something older than politics, something ineffable and potent. The sanctity of blood made dynastic politics feel, in a very real way, holy. This sanctity, however, brought both reverence and fear. Rivals did not simply challenge kings, they challenged the very legitimacy of the bloodline. Assassination, exile, and rebellion were not only threats to rulers but potential threats to the sanctity of Merovingian ancestry. The dynasty therefore employed a careful combination of secrecy, strategy, and symbolic reinforcement to protect itself. Marriages were arranged to secure alliances, heirs were closely monitored, and the public display of legitimacy, through hair, rituals, and ceremonies, reinforced the sacred aura surrounding the family. The obsession with blood extended beyond the immediate royal family. Nobles, warriors, and tribal leaders were often expected to trace their own lineages, establishing a network of loyalty anchored in kinship and obligation. Marriages became tools for political integration, creating bonds that were both familial and strategic. The Merovingians understood that authority was reinforced when those around them shared a sense of blood-based obligation. Power, in this context, was not merely held, it was inherited, recognized, and perpetuated across generations. Yet the system was fragile, and history demonstrates its inherent dangers. A childless king could provoke a succession crisis, while a weak heir could destabilize the realm. Rival factions within the family might seize power, turning sacred blood into a source of conflict. Every marriage, carefully calculated to reinforce authority, was also a potential point of vulnerability. A queen might have her own ambitions, a cousin might harbor resentment, and a son might challenge his father. The sacred line that gave the dynasty its strength could just as easily fracture under pressure. This interplay between power and vulnerability made the Merovingians masters of political theater. Rituals surrounding marriage, birth, and succession were designed not only to secure legitimacy but to signal stability to the people. Ceremonies were imbued with religious significance, transforming the act of producing heirs into a sacred duty. The kingdom itself was a stage, and every participant, from king to queen, from noble to commoner, played a role in affirming the continuity of the dynasty. The human stakes in these arrangements were profound. Marriages arranged for political gain could be cold or coercive. Children born to secure alliances could be pawns in dynastic games. Yet, for all its ruthlessness, this system also carried deep emotional weight. Parents placed their hopes, fears, and faith into the next generation. The success or failure of a child could determine the survival of an entire kingdom. Bloodlines were more than genetic inheritance. They were vessels of destiny, hope, and historical memory. Through these practices, the Merovingians created a dynasty that appeared almost timeless. Their authority was not dependent solely on immediate victories or fleeting popularity. It was embedded in blood, ritual, and the perception of sanctity. Even when kings were weak, their lineage could sustain them. Even when rivals attempted to usurp power, the sacredness of the family line offered a form of protection. And yet, for all its apparent invincibility, the system contained the seeds of its own fragility. Over time, the very focus on blood, marriage, and inheritance would contribute to internal division, manipulation, and decline. Sacred lineages, if mishandled, could become burdens, and the intense focus on ancestry could blind rulers to external threats. The very mechanism that allowed the Merovingians to rise so rapidly would, in future generations, make them vulnerable to those who understood the limits of symbolic authority. In understanding the role of blood and marriage in the Merovingian dynasty, we see a world in which politics, family, and myth were inseparable. Authority was lived, not simply declared. Kings ruled not merely with armies or decrees but through a network of relationships carefully constructed over generations. Every union, every child, every display of legitimacy reinforced the dynasty's claim to the throne. In this system, the personal was political, the familial was sacred, and the survival of a bloodline was the ultimate measure of power. It is this delicate intertwining of heritage, ambition, and belief that allows the Merovingians to occupy such a unique place in history. They are not merely rulers. They are symbols, vessels of ancestry, and embodiments of a worldview in which legitimacy is inseparable from blood. The dynasty's genius lay in understanding that to rule effectively, one must control not just territory or armies, but memory itself, woven into the very body of the family. In the end, the Merovingian focus on blood, marriage, and sacred inheritance is both practical and profoundly human. It reflects the realities of their world, a world where survival, loyalty, and legitimacy were constantly under threat, and the emotional stakes of lineage, hope, and continuity. The dynasty's enduring fascination lies in this delicate balance, the power of blood and the fragility of human life, intertwined in a story that shaped the destiny of Europe for centuries to come. The story of the Merovingians cannot be told without acknowledging the women who shaped it from behind the scenes. Queens like Brunhilde and Fredegund did not merely occupy ceremonial roles. They were architects of power, warriors of influence, and survivors in a world dominated by men and violence. Their rivalries, alliances, and strategies often determined the fate of entire kingdoms, proving that in the Merovingian era, power flowed as much through counsel and cunning as through sword or crown. Brunhilde, originally a Visigothic princess, arrived in the Frankish court as a young bride. She was celebrated for her intelligence, her education, and her unyielding spirit. Marriage for women of her status was always political, but Brunhilde approached hers with an acute awareness of its implications. She understood that her influence could extend far beyond the domestic sphere. By guiding her husband, navigating court intrigue, and raising heirs, she positioned herself as a central figure in the kingdom's governance. Her ambition, while remarkable, was inseparable from necessity. The survival of the dynasty often depended on her skill and vigilance. Fredegund, on the other hand, emerged from far humbler origins but rose to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an uncanny ability to manipulate political circumstance. Where Brunhilde relied on education and networks of loyalty, Fredegund exploited fear, opportunity, and decisiveness. She navigated the treacherous waters of Frankish politics with a precision that few could match, eliminating rivals and consolidating power in ways that defied contemporary gender norms. Her presence is a testament to the agency women could wield, even in societies that outwardly restricted them. The rivalry between Brunhilde and Fredegund is one of history's most notorious examples of female power intersecting with dynasty and bloodline. Their conflict was not simply personal. It was political, dynastic, and symbolic. Each queen represented a claim to legitimacy, a pathway to influence, and a faction within the complex network of Merovingian authority. The struggle for dominance between them often resulted in strategic marriages, assassinations, and public demonstrations of power, with consequences that reverberated across generations. In examining their influence, it becomes clear that queens were not peripheral actors. They were guardians of lineage, enforcers of sacred blood, and managers of the intricate web of alliances necessary for survival. Through marriage, birth, and counsel, they ensured that the dynasty remained intact even when kings were weak, distracted, or absent. Their strategies were often subtle, arranging marriages to secure loyalty, advising on succession to prevent conflict, and intervening in disputes to preserve the family's authority. At the same time, the emotional stakes for these women were enormous. Queens had to navigate a world in which loyalty was fluid, and betrayal could be sudden and violent. Decisions carried weight not only for the political structure but for the lives of their children, their allies, and themselves. The pressure to protect the bloodline was relentless, and the margin for error was virtually non-existent. Every choice had potential consequences that could either stabilize the dynasty or plunge it into chaos. This duality, political mastery intertwined with personal risk, defines much of the narrative surrounding Merovingian queens. They were simultaneously revered and feared, celebrated and vilified. Chroniclers often painted them in extremes, as virtuous and wise or cunning and cruel. Yet beneath these polarized depictions lies a common truth. These women were essential to the operation and survival of the dynasty. Their influence extended beyond ceremonial duties, directly shaping the political landscape of their time. Queens also served as cultural and spiritual intermediaries. In a world where religion and governance were inseparable, their guidance in matters of faith reinforced the dynasty's sacred authority. They oversaw ceremonies, influenced religious policy, and sometimes acted as patrons of monasteries and churches. By embedding themselves in the spiritual life of the kingdom, they helped sanctify the bloodline and legitimize the king's authority in the eyes of both nobles and commoners. Yet the methods of these women were not always peaceful. Historical accounts reveal a pattern of strategic ruthlessness that could rival any male rival's ambition. Assassinations, manipulation of succession, and political exile were part of the toolkit. The stakes were existential. Failure could mean the loss of a kingdom or the end of a dynasty. Within this context, the brutal tactics employed by Brunhilde, Fredegund, and other powerful queens are not merely acts of cruelty. They are strategies of survival in a perilous political environment. The stories of these queens also illuminate the broader social dynamics of the Merovingian era. While kings wielded visible power, the dynasty's stability often depended on networks of support maintained and enforced by women. Their authority was exercised through influence rather than title, persuasion rather than mandate, and legacy rather than immediate conquest. Yet despite this subtlety, the impact of their decisions was profound and enduring. The alliances they forged, the enemies they neutralized, and the heirs they raised shaped the kingdom's trajectory for decades. In a dynasty obsessed with blood, the role of queens was uniquely critical. They were conduits for the sacred line, protectors of inheritance, and mediators of dynastic ambition. Through their actions, they ensured that the mystical authority of the Merovingians survived political crises, external threats, and internal fragmentation. They also demonstrated that power could exist in forms other than military might, through intelligence, foresight, and the ability to manipulate both perception and circumstance. The rivalry of Brunhilde and Fredegund, while extreme, exemplifies the stakes of female power in the Merovingian world. Their conflicts were entwined with matters of succession, territorial control, and the preservation of sacred lineage. Each maneuver carried both immediate political consequences and long-term implications for the dynasty's survival. In navigating this dangerous terrain, these queens not only defended their own positions but actively shaped the course of history. Ultimately, the story of Merovingian queens challenges modern assumptions about medieval power. It reveals a world in which influence was often exercised quietly, indirectly, but with devastating effect. While kings may have commanded armies and territories, it was the women behind them who ensured continuity, protected lineage, and preserved the sacred authority of the dynasty. Their intelligence, resilience, and ruthlessness were not anomalies. They were necessities, forged in a world where the survival of a bloodline was never guaranteed. Brunhilde, Fredegund, and other powerful queens remind us that history is rarely the work of a single individual. It is the product of relationships, networks, and often invisible hands guiding events. In the Merovingian era, women were central to this process, their choices resonating across generations. Through them, the dynasty endured, thrived, and survived the constant turbulence of early medieval Europe. In this way, the queens of the Merovingians were not merely the backdrop for male rulers. They were forces in their own right, shaping the dynasty's destiny, manipulating political realities, and safeguarding sacred bloodlines. Their stories are proof that in the hidden corridors of power, in whispers and private councils, influence can be as decisive as any battlefield. And as we follow the unfolding drama of the Merovingian era, we will see that the struggle of these women was inseparable from the rise and fall of the dynasty itself, a testament to the enduring potency of intellect, strategy, and courage in the service of survival. Even as the Merovingian dynasty consolidated power through lineage, marriage, and sacred symbolism, the kingdom itself remained a fragile mosaic. The political structure of early Frankish Europe was never centralized. It was built upon a delicate balance of tribal loyalties, regional authority, and the shifting fortunes of rulers. One of the most enduring challenges for the Merovingians was the practice of dividing the kingdom among heirs, a tradition that simultaneously upheld family honor and sowed the seeds of fragmentation. Unlike modern monarchies, where primogeniture often ensured a single heir inherited the crown, early Merovingian custom dictated that a king's realm be divided among all legitimate sons. This practice was rooted in the belief that blood could not be concentrated in a single individual without dishonoring others of the same line. Equality among heirs was a reflection of divine order as much as human morality. Each son was a vessel of the sacred bloodline, deserving recognition and authority. Yet in practice, this meant that kingdoms were constantly subdivided, and political stability was rare. The consequences of these divisions were profound. Upon the death of a king, the realm might be partitioned into 2, 3, or even more territories, each ruled independently by a son or close relative. While this practice preserved the dignity of the bloodline, it also weakened centralized authority. Rivalries between brothers or cousins could erupt into full-scale wars, destabilizing the kingdom and opening opportunities for external threats. In this system, even a dynasty blessed with sacred ancestry and loyal subjects was vulnerable to internal collapse. These fragmented realms required a careful balance of diplomacy, intelligence, and often ruthless calculation. Alliances between brothers were as necessary as they were fragile. Temporary truces could be formed, but resentment simmered beneath the surface, and the threat of betrayal was ever present. A king might ally with one brother to subdue another, only to find that the same ally turned on him once the immediate threat had passed. Power was constantly negotiated, and survival depended on both strategic acumen and the ability to read human nature. The pattern of subdivision also created an environment in which queens and other family members could exercise extraordinary influence. By guiding their sons, manipulating alliances, and fostering loyalty among nobles, royal women acted as stabilizing forces amid the chaos. Their counsel could prevent open conflict or redirect its course, and their intervention often determined which heirs would thrive and which would be marginalized. In this sense, the division of the kingdom magnified the importance of familial networks and behind-the-scenes negotiation. Despite its dangers, the division of realms was rational within the context of Merovingian values. The dynasty's identity was inseparable from blood, and to deny a son his share of the kingdom would be to challenge the sacred lineage itself. Each heir was a living continuation of Merovec, a bearer of divine favor, and a protector of the bloodline. The system reinforced the sanctity of ancestry while embedding competition within the family, a tension that would define Merovingian politics for generations. The human cost of this system was significant. Civil wars erupted when disputes over territory turned violent. Nobles and commoners alike were caught in the crossfire, facing the devastation of repeated battles and shifting loyalties. The emotional stakes for the royal family were equally high. Fathers had to balance fairness with pragmatism, ensuring that each son received recognition while maintaining the cohesion of the dynasty. Brothers faced the dual pressures of kinship and ambition, forced to navigate a landscape in which family ties could be both protective and lethal. This dynamic also affected the perception of kingship itself. Unlike later monarchs whose authority appeared singular and absolute, Merovingian kingship was inherently collective. Each ruler existed within a network of blood relations, each fragment of the kingdom a reflection of familial hierarchy. Authority was not entirely centralized. It was distributed, shared, and constantly negotiated. This made the Merovingians vulnerable to internal strife, but it also embedded resilience. Even if one king fell, the dynasty itself could endure, carried forward by other branches of the family. Religious institutions played a role in managing these divisions. Bishops and monasteries often acted as mediators, offering spiritual authority to legitimize claims and discourage open conflict. The Church's involvement reinforced the sacred nature of bloodlines while providing a framework for arbitration. Religious endorsement became a tool for managing disputes that might otherwise escalate into war, highlighting the interplay between faith, family, and governance in early medieval Europe. Yet the system's very strength was also its weakness. The sacred emphasis on blood, combined with the fragmentation of the kingdom, created recurring instability. Every death could precipitate a crisis. Every succession could spark conflict. In a sense, the Merovingian world was a delicate experiment in balancing power, tradition, and divine symbolism. Its durability was remarkable, but it was always contingent upon careful management and strategic foresight. Over time, repeated divisions and internal conflicts contributed to the dynasty's eventual decline. The fragmentation that once allowed multiple heirs to honor the bloodline also weakened the monarchy, making it vulnerable to ambitious nobles and administrative figures, such as the mayors of the palace, who would later usurp authority. The practice of splitting realms, while initially a mechanism to preserve familial legitimacy, ultimately created conditions for the erosion of centralized Merovingian control. Even so, the divisions also reinforced the dynasty's identity. Each fragment, each king, was a living embodiment of Meroveca's blood. The survival of the family did not depend on a single individual, but on the resilience of the lineage itself. In this way, the fragmentation of realms was both a political hazard and a safeguard, a paradox that defines much of Merovingian history. The Merovingians' approach to succession and division illuminates the broader cultural and psychological values of early medieval Europe. Authority was inseparable from ancestry, and fairness within the family was not optional, it was sacred. At the same time, ambition, rivalry, and the desire for personal glory were equally human and unavoidable. The tension between these forces shaped the political landscape, producing a dynasty that was at once resilient and perpetually fragile. In the end, the fragmentation of the kingdom highlights a central truth about the Merovingians. Their strength lay not solely in conquest or ceremony, but in the careful orchestration of blood, loyalty, and perception. The dynasty was built on the idea that power could be inherited, shared, and sanctified, yet this same system required constant vigilance. Every division, every alliance, and every succession was a calculated gamble, balancing the sacred obligations of lineage against the ruthless realities of political life. Through these repeated partitions, the Merovingians maintained their identity even as their kingdom became increasingly vulnerable. They demonstrated that authority could be as much a matter of belief, ritual, and family strategy as of military conquest. And they showed that the preservation of sacred bloodlines required constant negotiation, foresight, and sometimes ruthless pragmatism, a lesson that would echo throughout their dynasty and beyond, shaping the way Europe understood kingship for centuries to come. As the Merovingian kings managed the precarious balance of family, blood, and territory, another form of power quietly emerged, one that would ultimately eclipse the kings themselves. The mayors of the palace, initially administrative officials responsible for managing the household and estates of the Merovingian king, began to accumulate influence in ways few could have predicted. What started as domestic oversight gradually evolved into a parallel authority, a shadow monarchy that operated both within and around the official kingship. This slow, almost imperceptible shift would reshape the political landscape of early medieval Europe. The office of the mayor of the palace, or mayordomus, was originally practical. Kings, particularly as they became increasingly ceremonial, relied on these officials to manage day-to-day governance, collecting taxes, overseeing the distribution of royal resources, and coordinating military expeditions. In theory, the mayor served at the king's pleasure, subordinate and invisible. In practice, the role allowed for the accumulation of extraordinary knowledge and influence. Those who held it controlled the machinery of governance, maintained communication with local nobles, and could exercise authority on behalf of the king without directly challenging the sacred lineage. It is crucial to understand the environment in which these officials rose. By the later Merovingian period, many kings, often referred to as the Roisfanians, had become increasingly detached from active rule. The symbolic nature of kingship, tied to sacred hair, divine ancestry, and ritual, meant that the king's authority was deeply entrenched in perception rather than in daily administration. This created a vacuum of practical power. Someone had to make decisions, enforce law, and maintain the delicate balance between noble families, regional loyalties, and the church. The mayors of the palace stepped into that void. Over time, certain families mastered the office, consolidating it as a hereditary position in all but name. The Pippinids, for example, gradually turned the role into a launchpad for political dominance. They were not kings, but they controlled the levers of power more effectively than many of the kings they served. Their position allowed them to marshal armies, negotiate treaties, and manipulate succession. Slowly, the distinction between service and authority blurred. A mayor could command loyalty that rivaled, or even surpassed, that of the king himself. This rise of silent authority illustrates a profound truth about early medieval politics. Visibility did not always equate to power. The Merovingian kings retained the outward symbols of rule, the hair, the coronation rituals, the sacred lineage, but the day-to-day control of the kingdom increasingly depended on capable administrators who understood the mechanics of governance. Authority was shifting from symbolic legitimacy to practical execution. The monarchy remained sacred, but its substance was slowly being siphoned into the hands of those who could wield it. The consequences of this shift were both immediate and long-term. Kings remained the figureheads of divine favor, their presence necessary for legitimacy. Yet their inability or unwillingness to manage affairs directly opened opportunities for ambitious mayors to dictate policy, control resources, and influence succession. A weak king could be manipulated or ignored entirely, while a strong mayor could consolidate support among the nobility and military, positioning himself as the true power behind the throne. This dynamic created a new layer of tension in the Merovingian political system. Kings, who had once embodied both sacred and practical authority, found themselves increasingly ceremonial. Their long hair and divine ancestry remained potent symbols, but symbols alone could not enforce obedience, collect taxes, or organize armies. The erosion of administrative authority left the dynasty vulnerable to internal subversion, a vulnerability that would eventually be exploited to catastrophic effect. The role of the church in this transformation cannot be overstated. Bishops and abbots often collaborated with mayors of the palace to maintain stability. They were pragmatic actors, seeking to preserve order, protect their own interests, and ensure that the king's symbolic authority was recognized, even if his practical power was limited. In this sense, the church became a mediator between sacred legitimacy and administrative reality, further enhancing the influence of capable mayors who understood how to navigate ecclesiastical networks. It is also important to recognize the subtlety of this transition. Unlike violent coups or open usurpations, the rise of the mayors of the palace was incremental, almost imperceptible. Power shifted gradually, embedded in the day-to-day operations of the kingdom, in networks of loyalty, and in the practical necessities of governance. Kings did not lose their authority overnight. It was quietly siphoned away by those who understood the machinery of administration and could operate effectively within it. The implications of this shift are profound. The Merovingians had built a dynasty rooted in sacred blood, ceremonial authority, and symbolic legitimacy. Yet, in a system increasingly dependent on practical governance, these foundations were insufficient. Authority that could not be exercised on a daily basis could be appropriated by those who could act decisively. In other words, sacred lineage remained vital for appearance, but it was no longer sufficient for control. By the late 7th century, the mayors of the palace were no longer merely administrators. They were kingmakers, military commanders, and de facto rulers. Their authority, while still framed as service to the king, allowed them to dominate the political landscape. Eventually, this concentration of power would enable figures like Charles Martel to challenge the Merovingians openly, setting the stage for the rise of the Carolingian dynasty. Yet even in this eventual transition, the process began quietly, through the incremental accumulation of influence by those who understood how to act when the king could not or would not. The rise of the mayors of the palace demonstrates a central tension in Merovingian governance: the distinction between sacred authority and practical power. Kings embodied divine lineage, their presence legitimized by ritual and myth. Yet their ability to manage the kingdom relied increasingly on officials who could translate sacred authority into actionable governance. This tension, subtle but profound, defines much of the dynasty's later history. It explains both the longevity of Merovingian symbolic authority and the vulnerability of its practical rule. In essence, the emergence of the mayors of the palace illustrates that power is not monolithic. It can be divided, delegated, and quietly redefined. The Merovingians retained the symbols of kingship, the sacred hair, the ceremonial rituals, and the narrative of divine descent. But the day-to-day reality of ruling, of maintaining order, of commanding loyalty, gradually shifted into the hands of others. This slow, invisible transfer of authority highlights the fragility inherent in a system that relies heavily on perception and myth. Ultimately, the rise of the mayors of the palace signals a turning point in early medieval Europe. Authority was no longer solely a function of blood, ritual, or lineage. It was increasingly a product of action, administration, and the strategic accumulation of influence. The Merovingians' reliance on sacred symbolism could preserve their legitimacy, but it could not enforce obedience indefinitely. The kingdom needed managers, organizers, and operators, those who could turn myth into practical governance. In this space, the mayors of the palace became indispensable, the quiet architects of a political reality that would outlast the kings themselves. This slow shift of power underscores a critical lesson about leadership in early medieval Europe. To rule effectively, authority must be both recognized and exercised. Sacred ancestry provides recognition, but practical governance demands action. The Merovingians excelled in the former, but over time, they ceded the latter. The rise of the mayors of the palace is the story of how the balance of power can shift quietly, almost imperceptibly, until the rulers themselves become ceremonial, while the real architects of destiny operate from the shadows. In the unfolding drama of the Merovingian dynasty, the emergence of these shadow rulers is a reminder that history often moves not through dramatic battles alone, but through the gradual accumulation of influence, the quiet mastery of administration, and the subtle manipulation of perception. Kings may hold the crown, but power, real, actionable power, sometimes resides elsewhere, in hands unseen but profoundly consequential. As the Merovingian dynasty progressed into the later centuries, the image of the kings began to shift dramatically. Chroniclers, writing decades or even generations after the events, began referring to a peculiar class of rulers known as the Roisfanians, the do-nothing kings. These were monarchs who, unlike Clovis or Childeric, were seen as passive, weak, or entirely symbolic. At first glance, this seems like a straightforward historical judgment. The later kings were ineffectual, overshadowed by their mayors of the palace, and unable to control their kingdoms. But a closer examination suggests a far more complex picture, one in which perception, narrative, and deliberate sidelining played as significant a role as personal incompetence. The Roisfanians were products of both circumstance and propaganda. By the 7th century, the Merovingian kingship had evolved into a deeply ritualized institution. Authority was no longer measured by the ability to wage war, govern estates, or negotiate alliances alone. It was also measured by adherence to symbolic norms, sacred hair, ceremonial conduct, and maintenance of dynastic mythology. Kings who fell short in visible action could be labeled as weak, even if their bloodline and ceremonial presence remained indispensable to the functioning of the kingdom. This labeling served a purpose. As the mayors of the palace grew in influence, chroniclers, many of whom were connected to the church or to political factions aligned with the mayors, had an interest in portraying the kings as powerless. By emphasizing passivity and incompetence, these writers justified the accumulation of authority in the hands of administrators. A king who could do nothing was a king whose office needed support, a king whose symbolic authority could be redirected without openly defying tradition. In this way, history itself became a tool of political manipulation. Yet the picture is far more nuanced. Many of these so-called do-nothing kings were not truly powerless in the sense modern observers might assume. They retained sacred legitimacy, the divine sanction that had been cultivated for centuries. Their long hair, ritual duties, and genealogical authority still commanded respect. In societies where belief in sacred blood was central to governance, the mere presence of a Merovingian king could stabilize regions, deter rebellion, and maintain continuity. Even without direct action, these kings functioned as focal points of loyalty and tradition. The tension between symbolic authority and practical power created a delicate dance. Mayors of the palace managed administration, marshaled armies, and negotiated treaties, yet they relied on the king's sacred presence to legitimize their actions. A decree issued by a mayor was reinforced if the king was visibly present, if ritual and bloodline sanctified it. Conversely, a king without an effective mayor was helpless to implement policy. In this sense, the Roysphanians were not simply victims of history. They were participants in a system that balanced ritual authority with administrative necessity. This system also had psychological and cultural dimensions. The Merovingian people had been conditioned to associate kingship with sacred blood, long hair, and ceremonial conduct. To deny these symbols was to challenge divine order. Even an inactive king could serve as a stabilizing figurehead, reminding nobles, warriors, and commoners alike that the continuity of the dynasty remained intact. In many ways, the Roysphanians exemplify the Merovingian genius. Power was not merely exercised. It was embodied, ritualized, and performed. However, the perception of weakness carried dangers. Chroniclers, often writing from the perspective of the Carolingian successors or allied factions, emphasized the passivity of later kings to highlight the inevitability of administrative takeover. Over time, the narrative hardened. The Roysphanians were portrayed as incapable, lazy, and irrelevant, while the mayors of the palace were heroic, competent, and decisive. This historiographical lens obscured the subtle complexities of Merovingian rule, presenting a simplification that has persisted for centuries. The labeling of kings as do-nothing also reflects a broader theme in Merovingian governance: the tension between symbolic legitimacy and functional authority. Sacred power could preserve dynastic continuity, yet it was insufficient for responding to practical challenges. Kings were bound by tradition, constrained by ritual, and dependent on intermediaries to exercise their will. Authority was thus a layered construct, where perception mattered as much as action. The Roysphanians embody this paradox: powerful in myth and blood, yet constrained in practice. This paradox becomes even more evident when considering succession and internal politics. Divisions among heirs, disputes over territories, and the ambitions of family members created constant pressure on kings. To act decisively risked alienating factions. To remain passive invited criticism. Many kings chose caution, relying on tradition and ritual to maintain authority, rather than engaging in overt displays of power. To modernize, this may appear as ineffectiveness. To contemporaries, it was a careful balancing act. Religious authorities played a central role in sustaining the authority of these kings. Bishops, abbots, and other clerical figures endorsed ceremonial acts, mediated disputes, and interpreted sacred bloodlines. Through ritual and narrative, they reinforced the king's legitimacy, even when practical governance was delegated. In this sense, the Roysphanians were active participants in a symbiotic system. They provided sacred legitimacy, while others executed the administrative and military functions necessary to maintain order. Yet the limitations of symbolic power were inevitable. Over time, the increasing competence and ambition of mayors of the palace undermined the perception of the king's relevance. The more functional authority resided in the hands of administrators, the more chroniclers and observers emphasized the king's passivity. This created a feedback loop. As kings appeared less effective, their authority became more symbolic, allowing mayors to consolidate power further. By the 8th century, this dynamic would culminate in the Carolingian takeover, a transition that seemed, in hindsight, almost inevitable. Despite this eventual eclipse, the Roysphanians played a critical role in preserving the dynasty's identity. They maintained the continuity of sacred blood, ensured ceremonial legitimacy, and acted as vessels of dynastic memory. Their presence, even when largely passive, prevented the total erasure of Merovingian authority, providing a foundation for historical memory, cultural identity, and ritualized kingship. Without these symbolic kings, the narrative of the Merovingians would have been far easier to overwrite, and the later rise of the Carolingians might have lacked the veneer of continuity that legitimized their rule. In examining the Roysphanians, one begins to appreciate the subtlety of Merovingian governance. Authority was multifaceted. It was simultaneously sacred and practical, embodied and performed, visible and invisible. Kings were expected to exist within this complex framework, mediating between tradition, ritual, and the necessities of governance. The label of do-nothing obscures the sophistication of their role, reducing it to a moral judgment rather than an understanding of political context. Ultimately, the story of the Royce-Faineants reveals the central tension of Merovingian kingship, the coexistence of sacred legitimacy and practical administration. It demonstrates that authority is not solely defined by action, but by perception, ritual, and belief. And it underscores the fragile balance that the dynasty maintained for centuries, a balance in which power could be both potent and illusory, exercised and delegated, real and symbolic. The Royce-Faineants are a reminder that history is rarely straightforward. Weakness and strength can coexist, and apparent passivity can conceal profound influence. In the Merovingian era, kingship was not measured only by conquest or legislation, but by the ability to embody sacred lineage, maintain continuity, and operate within the invisible networks of loyalty, ritual, and belief. Even as they were overshadowed by mayors of the palace, the Royce-Faineants remained essential to the dynasty's identity, a living link to the sacred blood that defined the Merovingians' claim to history itself. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, stands as a somber symbol of a dynasty in decline. By the time he ascended the throne in the mid-7th century, the Merovingians' authority had already been hollowed out, their sacred lineage preserved in name but stripped of practical power. Childeric's kingship was brief, largely ceremonial, and carefully managed by the very officials who would eventually replace his family, the mayors of the palace. His reign illustrates the profound tension between symbolic authority and real governance, and it underscores how dynasties can endure in form even as their power erodes. Childeric III's life and reign are enveloped in both historical record and deliberate ambiguity. Few details survive about his birth, upbringing, or personality. Chronicles focus on his coronation and eventual deposition, emphasizing the performative aspects of kingship rather than substantive acts. He was the last living embodiment of Meroveca's sacred blood, a final thread linking the contemporary kingdom to the legendary sea-born ancestor. In a society that valued lineage above all else, this made him indispensable in theory, even if in practice he wielded little control. The ceremony of Childeric's ascension highlights the enduring importance of ritual. He was crowned in the traditional manner, with sacred symbols and ceremonial pomp designed to confer legitimacy. His hair was long, as befitted a Merovingian king, a visible marker of sacred authority. By participating in these rituals, Childeric reinforced the continuity of a line that had endured for centuries. Even if his power was largely nominal, the performance of kingship mattered deeply to nobles, clergy, and the broader population. Ritual, in this context, was as significant as military might. Yet beneath the surface of ceremony, the reality of Childeric's reign was stark. The mayors of the palace, particularly those from the increasingly powerful Pippinid family, controlled the administrative and military levers of the kingdom. Decisions about taxation, war, and governance were made by officials who owed their loyalty to their office, not to sacred blood. Childeric existed as a figurehead, a vessel for legitimacy that masked the true center of power. The contrast between his symbolic authority and the practical authority of the mayors illustrates the profound shift in Merovingian governance. Kingship remained sacred, but sovereignty was being quietly redefined. The deposition of Childeric III in 751 marks a turning point not only for the Merovingians, but for European history. Pope Zachary sanctioned the removal of the king, allowing Pepin the Short, then mayor of the palace, to assume the throne with both ecclesiastical and popular legitimacy. The method of Childeric's removal was deliberate and symbolic. He was tonsured, shorn of his sacred hair, and confined to a monastery. This act was both ritualistic and political. By cutting his hair, the sacred mark of authority was erased. By placing him in a monastery, he was removed from political contention without the bloodshed that could have undermined the legitimacy of the transition. Childeric's deposition was more than the end of a single reign. It was the culmination of centuries of gradual power transfer. The Merovingians had created a system in which authority was partly sacred, partly practical. Over time, the practical element had been appropriated by administrators who understood how to navigate the machinery of governance. By the time Childeric ascended, the symbolic authority of the Merovingian line was no longer sufficient to sustain independent rule. His removal was both inevitable and carefully managed, a surgical end to centuries of dynastic supremacy. Yet Childeric's story also illuminates the resilience of legacy. Even in deposition, he remained a link to the sacred bloodline. His confinement to a monastery did not erase the memory of the Merovingian line, it simply transformed it. The dynasty's authority persisted in ritual, legend, and collective memory, influencing both the Carolingian successors and subsequent generations. The Merovingians had learned to encode power not only in action, but in myth and ceremony, a strategy that allowed their influence to survive even after their political relevance had vanished. The human dimension of Childeric's fate is striking. He was, in many ways, a king without agency, stripped of practical power and confined to a life of obscurity. His life underscores the precariousness of authority based solely on sacred lineage, particularly when it is divorced from the ability to exercise control. At the same time, it highlights the careful negotiation inherent in political transitions. The new rulers sought to assert dominance without undermining the symbolic legitimacy that still mattered to subjects and clergy alike. Childeric's deposition also signals a broader transformation in European kingship. Authority was shifting from bloodline and ritual toward office, action, and institutional support. The monarchy was no longer defined exclusively by sacred lineage. It required the ability to govern, enforce decisions, and command loyalty in practice. This shift set the stage for the Carolingian era, in which rulers would combine ceremonial authority with administrative competence, military power, and strategic alliances. Childeric, in this context, represents both an endpoint and a bridge, a final Merovingian king whose fall clears the path for a new conception of monarchy. Despite the brevity and apparent weakness of his reign, Childeric III's legacy is profound. He embodies the enduring tension between sacred symbolism and practical power, a tension that defined the Merovingian dynasty from its earliest days. His life and deposition demonstrate that kingship can exist as a ritualized, symbolic institution even when real authority has shifted elsewhere, a lesson that resonates in political systems throughout history. In reflecting on Childeric III, one sees both the fragility and the resilience of dynastic authority. On one hand, the dynasty was vulnerable, reliant on ceremony and lineage in a world increasingly dominated by pragmatic governance. On the other hand, the symbolic power of the Merovingians, embodied in kings like Childeric, ensured that their memory persisted long after their political influence waned. They had encoded their authority in blood, ritual, and myth, a strategy that allowed their legacy to survive even as their reign came to an unceremonious, yet meticulously controlled, end. Ultimately, Childeric III represents the final act of the Merovingian saga, a king who carried the weight of sacred ancestry but lacked the instruments to wield power in a changing world. His tonsure and exile mark not only the fall of a dynasty, but the careful transition from one form of kingship to another. The sacred bloodline was no longer sufficient. Practical authority had become paramount. Yet even in obscurity, Childeric's presence reminds us that legitimacy is as much about memory, ritual, and belief as it is about military conquest or administrative skill. In his fate, the dynasty's story reaches both an end and a turning point, illustrating the complex interplay between myth, blood, and power that defines the history of the Merovingians. The fall of the Merovingian kings did not occur in isolation. It was accompanied by a systematic rewriting of history, orchestrated to legitimize the rise of the Carolingians and to secure the transition of power without widespread upheaval. The Carolingian rewrite was not merely a political maneuver. It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed to reshape memory, redefine authority, and obscure the enduring influence of a sacred bloodline that had dominated Gaul for centuries. In understanding this process, we see how power can be as much about storytelling as about armies or territory. From the moment Pepin the Short assumed the throne in 751, the question of legitimacy loomed large. The Merovingians, though politically weakened, still commanded immense symbolic authority. Sacred hair, ancestral lineage, and centuries of ritual gave even a powerless king the weight of tradition. To dethrone the last Merovingian without provoking rebellion required more than force. It required consent, endorsement, and the careful management of perception. The solution was twofold: religious sanction and historical reinterpretation. Pope Zachary's involvement was central to this strategy. By sanctioning Pepin's coronation, the Church provided a veneer of divine legitimacy to a political maneuver that might otherwise have been perceived as usurpation. The narrative was framed to suggest that authority naturally flowed to those who could wield it effectively. In this way, sacred power and practical governance were reconciled in theory, if not in reality. Pepin was no longer simply a mayor of the palace. He was a king endorsed by God and history, his right to rule carefully justified in both legal and spiritual terms. Parallel to the papal endorsement, chroniclers undertook a more subtle task: the reshaping of Merovingian history itself. Earlier kings were increasingly portrayed as weak, passive, or ineffectual, do-nothing rulers who could not govern without the guidance of administrators. The narrative emphasized administrative failure and ceremonial excess, downplaying achievements and victories. The purpose was not to erase the dynasty entirely, but to frame it as a relic of a bygone era, a symbolic link that had outlived its utility. By contrast, the mayors of the palace, particularly the Pippinids, were cast as competent, decisive, and morally fit to wield real authority. The contrast created a logical, almost inevitable justification for the transfer of kingship. This rewriting had both immediate and long-term effects. In the short term, it smoothed the transition, reducing the likelihood of rebellion or claims by Merovingian loyalists. In the long term, it shaped the collective memory of the dynasty for generations. Subsequent histories, written by clerics often aligned with Carolingian interests, reinforced the perception that the Merovingians were ceremonial, passive, and ultimately expendable. Their sacred ancestry, once a source of immense legitimacy, was now depicted as irrelevant, a curiosity rather than a foundation of rule. Yet this narrative was carefully controlled. The Merovingians were not portrayed as wholly illegitimate. Their bloodline remained acknowledged, their rituals recorded, and their symbolic authority preserved in memory. By maintaining fragments of respect and recognition, Carolingian chroniclers ensured continuity. The dynasty's symbolic power was absorbed into the new regime, allowing Pepin and his successors to claim authority without appearing to break with tradition entirely. It was a masterclass in historical management. Erasure and preservation, critique and continuity, carefully balanced to achieve political objectives. The process also highlights a profound truth about history. It is shaped by those who write it. Power is not only exercised through armies or law, it is exercised through narrative. By controlling the story of the Merovingians, the Carolingians controlled perception, securing legitimacy for themselves while relegating centuries of kingship to the status of symbolic memory. The rewrite was a political act as much as a historiographical one, transforming memory into a tool of governance. Moreover, the rewriting underscores the fragile nature of legitimacy. Sacred blood and ceremonial authority, which had sustained the Merovingians for generations, could be undermined by reinterpretation. The same symbols that once commanded awe, the long hair, the sacred lineage, the ritual coronations, could be reframed as archaic, ineffective, or ornamental. Authority, in this sense, was not fixed. It could be transferred, diluted, or redefined through narrative. The Merovingians' downfall was as much a victory of storytelling as it was a victory of arms. This careful reconstruction of memory also affected the perception of morality, leadership, and divine favor. By depicting Merovingian kings as passive or ineffectual, chroniclers created a moral argument for Carolingian rule. Competence became intertwined with divine sanction. Pepin's authority was justified not only by ritual and papal endorsement, but also by a moral narrative. He was the capable steward chosen to restore order where the Merovingians had failed. The rewrite, therefore, combined politics, morality, and historiography into a seamless argument for the legitimacy of a new regime. Yet the process was not merely manipulative. It was also reflective of evolving conceptions of power. The shift from Merovingian sacred kingship to Carolingian practical authority illustrates how governance adapts to changing circumstances. In a fragmented, ritualized system, symbolic legitimacy was paramount. In a system increasingly focused on administration, law, and military capability, narrative and perception became tools to align symbolic authority with practical power. The rewrite was a necessary step to reconcile these two forms of legitimacy and ensure a stable transfer of sovereignty. In essence, the Carolingian rewrite reveals the intricate interplay between memory and power. The Merovingians were not destroyed, they were transformed in the collective imagination. Their sacred ancestry and ceremonial kingship were preserved in fragments, carefully reframed to highlight passivity and symbolic function. By controlling how the past was remembered, the Carolingians controlled how authority was perceived. History became an instrument of governance, shaping both contemporary politics and the memory of the dynasty for generations to come. The implications extend beyond the Merovingians themselves. This process demonstrates that dynastic authority depends not only on conquest, marriage, or ritual, but on the perception of legitimacy. Symbols can be manipulated, memory can be reframed, and narratives can shift the balance of power. The fall of the Merovingians and the rise of the Carolingians illustrate how historical storytelling functions as a form of authority, capable of reshaping the past to secure control over the present and future. Ultimately, the Carolingian rewrite highlights the delicate interplay of politics, memory, and legitimacy. The Merovingians, once rulers of sacred blood and ritualized authority, were reduced to symbolic figures, their achievements reframed as ceremonial rather than substantive. Yet even in this transformation, their legacy endured, preserved in myth, ritual, and the memory of generations. By reshaping history, the Carolingians secured their own power while demonstrating that authority is never fixed. It is negotiated, narrated, and perpetually reconstructed through the stories we choose to tell. Chroniclers, bishops, and political actors thus became the architects of legitimacy, demonstrating that power is exercised as much in memory as in action. The Merovingians' past was rewritten, but it was not erased. Their sacred bloodline, their rituals, and their symbols remained visible, even as the narrative cast them as powerless. Through this careful balance of erasure and preservation, the Carolingians legitimized their rule, ensuring that the transition of power appeared both natural and divinely sanctioned, a testament to the enduring potency of narrative in shaping history and authority. The erasure of the Merovingians was not abrupt, nor was it entirely violent. Unlike the dramatic conquests or bloody purges often associated with regime change, the decline of this dynasty was carried out quietly, methodically, and symbolically. The process was subtle, almost surgical, executed through ritual, narrative, and the slow accumulation of administrative power by others. By the time Childeric III was dethroned, much of the groundwork for erasure had already been laid, demonstrating the dynasty's vulnerability despite its long history and sacred lineage. After the rise of the mayors of the palace and the increasing dominance of Carolingian figures, the Merovingians' visibility was reduced. Kings still existed, but they were ceremonial, performing rites, overseeing coronations, and maintaining traditions that preserved the illusion of continuity. Their sacred long hair and bloodline remained, but these symbols could no longer translate into action or enforce loyalty. It was a delicate balancing act. Enough presence to legitimize the new rulers, but insufficient power to challenge them. In this sense, the dynasty's erasure was as much psychological as political, accomplished by controlling perception rather than coercion. Monasteries played a crucial role in this process. The Church, which had once been an instrument of Merovingian legitimacy, became a partner in their neutralization. Kings who were dethroned were often tonsured and confined to monastic life, a fate that combined ritual, isolation, and dignity. By removing them from political life without bloodshed, the transition maintained religious propriety while eliminating potential rivals. Monasteries became quiet prisons, preserving the existence of the dynasty while neutralizing its influence. The very institutions that had once reinforced Merovingian authority now became instruments of its suppression. Yet the erasure was not total. Some Merovingians survived in obscurity, their existence noted in minor records or hidden genealogies. Others may have lived in exile, cloistered within noble households or distant regions. These remnants of the line demonstrate that erasure was never about annihilation. It was about control. By removing the symbolic markers of power, ceremonial visibility, sacred hair, public authority, the dynasty could be rendered politically inert without eradicating its physical members. In other words, to neutralize a Merovingian was to strip the aura of kingship, not necessarily the life of the individual. The manipulation of memory was equally important. Chroniclers and clerics gradually reframed the narrative of the Merovingians, emphasizing their passivity, internal weakness, and ceremonial role. They were described as incapable of governance, their achievements downplayed, their influence minimized. This historiographical strategy ensured that future generations would perceive the dynasty as obsolete, reinforcing the legitimacy of the new rulers without necessitating further conflict. The process of erasure, therefore, operated not only in practice but in perception, embedding the decline of the Merovingians into collective memory. Political marriages and inheritance arrangements also contributed to the suppression of the dynasty. By aligning territories and noble loyalties with emerging Carolingian authority, the practical control of lands that had once reinforced Merovingian kingship shifted away from the old line. Nobles increasingly pledged allegiance to the administrators who held functional power rather than the symbolic kings whose authority was ceremonial. Over time, this realignment of loyalty further weakened the political foundation of the Merovingians, ensuring that their sacred lineage alone could not sustain rule. The symbolic methods of erasure were subtle but profound. Sacred hair, the ultimate marker of Merovingian legitimacy, was systematically removed through tonsure. Ritual, which had once empowered kings, was now used to neutralize them. Even the language of chroniclers became a tool of suppression. By framing Merovingian kings as passive, ceremonial, or incapable, historians of the era embedded a narrative that justified the shift of authority while preserving the veneer of legitimacy. The dynasty's erasure was both practical and psychological, accomplished through ritual, narrative, and perception rather than brute force. This slow neutralization of the Merovingians illustrates a broader lesson about power in medieval Europe. Authority was not solely exercised through armies or law. It depended on visibility, perception, and the ability to act within established structures. By controlling both the symbols of power and the narrative of legitimacy, the Carolingians, and those who supported them, were able to remove a centuries-old dynasty without destabilizing the kingdom. The Merovingians' fate demonstrates that political survival depends as much on narrative and ritual as it does on conquest and legislation. At the same time, the erasure was inherently fragile. The Merovingians' bloodline could not be entirely eliminated. Descendants may have survived in monasteries, distant estates, or obscured branches of the family. Some legends persisted, whispered in local traditions or encoded in genealogical records. These surviving threads suggest that erasure is never absolute. Memory, blood, and myth can endure even when visible authority has vanished. The dynasty's physical presence may have been neutralized, but its symbolic power, though diminished, continued to influence the imagination of chroniclers, nobles, and the wider populace. The decline also reveals the strategic genius of symbolic power. By preserving the appearance of continuity through ritual, ceremonial acknowledgement, and limited participation in religious life, the new rulers avoided the risks of total confrontation. Violence was minimized, rebellion was less likely, and the transition of authority appeared natural. The Merovingians were removed from practical governance, yet their legacy remained legible enough to maintain stability. In this way, the dynasty's erasure was not an act of obliteration, but of recontextualization. Kingship existed, but only in a form that could no longer challenge the new order. Ultimately, the story of the Merovingians' erasure underscores the complexity of power, legitimacy, and memory. Authority is never solely about the capacity to act. It is also about perception, belief, and ritual. By targeting the symbols that sustained kingship, ritual visibility, sacred hair, and dynastic narrative, emerging powers could neutralize the dynasty without bloodshed. The Merovingians were transformed from rulers to symbols, their practical authority removed while their sacred lineage persisted in diminished, carefully controlled forms. This quiet, methodical neutralization offers a profound insight into medieval politics. Sometimes the most effective way to remove a dynasty is not through annihilation, but through subtle control of perception, ritual, and historical memory. The Merovingians survived physically in obscurity, yet their power was carefully eroded, ensuring the stability of the new rulers. It was a masterclass in the intersection of politics, symbolism, and narrative, a process that demonstrates how authority can be preserved, manipulated, and ultimately redirected without a single battlefield being fought. The Merovingians' experience is a reminder that dynasties are as vulnerable to narrative as they are to armies, and that power resides not only in blood or ritual, but in the way history remembers or chooses to forget. Even as the dynasty faded into obscurity, the threads of memory, myth, and ceremonial significance endured, influencing the imagination of future generations and ensuring that, though politically erased, the Merovingians were never truly forgotten. The Church, which had once been a supporter and legitimizer of Merovingian authority, gradually emerged as a central player in the dynasty's transformation. In early medieval Europe, the relationship between kingship and religion was intimate and reciprocal. Sacred bloodlines, ritual coronations, and the divine sanction of rulers intertwined with the spiritual authority of bishops and monasteries. The Merovingians relied on the Church to sanctify their power, while the Church benefited from royal patronage and protection. Yet, as the dynasty weakened and mayors of the palace grew in influence, the Church shifted from being merely a legitimizing force to an active participant in the redefinition and eventual suppression of Merovingian authority. Initially, the Church's support was indispensable. Merovingian kings depended on bishops and abbots to mediate disputes, administer law, and reinforce loyalty among the nobility. Religious institutions reinforced the sanctity of the dynasty, ensuring that sacred lineage and ceremonial legitimacy were respected across the kingdom. The king's long hair, sacred coronation rituals, and ceremonial presence were validated through ecclesiastical endorsement. In essence, the Church transformed symbolic authority into a tangible form of social control, bridging the gap between myth and governance. However, as Merovingian kings became increasingly ceremonial and passive, the Church found itself navigating a delicate balance. On one hand, maintaining the sacred lineage was essential for social stability. The populace believed in the legitimacy of kings who carried divine blood, and religious rituals reinforced that belief. On the other hand, the practical governance of the kingdom required capable administrators. The Church began collaborating with mayors of the palace, recognizing that these officials were more effective at implementing policies, maintaining order, and defending the realm. In doing so, the Church subtly shifted its loyalty from the ceremonial king to the practical executor of power. This shift was strategic and pragmatic. By aligning with the mayors of the palace, the Church ensured that its interests, land, influence, and authority were protected regardless of the ceremonial ruler's capabilities. Bishops and abbots could maintain stability, oversee the administration of justice, and secure ecclesiastical privileges through cooperation with functional power holders rather than symbolic kings. This alignment also allowed the Church to participate in the selection and legitimization of new rulers, a role that would become formalized during the transition to Carolingian authority. The tension between sacred authority and administrative power becomes clear when examining the deposition of Childeric III. While the mayors of the palace held practical control, it was the Pope's endorsement that provided religious legitimacy for Pepin the Short's ascension. The Church, in effect, sanctioned the replacement of one sacred bloodline with another authority capable of governing. This demonstrates the Church's evolving role. It was no longer a mere observer or legitimizer, but a decisive arbiter in the balance between tradition and functionality. By sanctioning the change, the Church ensured continuity of divine approval while facilitating the practical consolidation of power. The Church's involvement also influenced the narrative surrounding Merovingian kings. Chroniclers, many of whom were clergy or educated under ecclesiastical supervision, framed the later Merovingians as ceremonial and ineffectual. The Roisfanians were depicted as incapable of governing without guidance, reinforcing the moral argument that practical authority should rest with the mayors of the palace. By controlling historical memory, the Church contributed to the perception that sacred blood alone was insufficient for effective rule, creating both a justification for change and a preservation of order. At the same time, The Church ensured that the sacred aura of the Merovingians was never entirely erased. Rituals continued to acknowledge the ceremonial kings. Sacred hair and lineage were documented, and religious ceremonies preserved the appearance of continuity. This delicate balance allowed the Church to neutralize threats without undermining the broader belief system. The Merovingians' symbolic authority persisted, but their practical influence was diminished, a demonstration of how religious institutions could wield immense power through control of perception, ritual, and historical memory. The interplay between bloodline, ritual, and religious authority also underscores a broader medieval principle. Legitimacy was as much about belief as action. Sacred lineage provided a moral and spiritual foundation for rule, but it could be reinterpreted or redirected by those who controlled ecclesiastical structures. In this sense, the Church became both a preserver and a negotiator of dynastic authority, capable of sustaining symbolic legitimacy while guiding the practical governance of the kingdom. The Church's role in this transformation was not merely reactive. It was proactive. Bishops and abbots exercised influence over succession, mediated disputes, and ensured that rituals and ceremonies reinforced the desired social order. By participating in these processes, the Church effectively managed the transition of power, embedding itself as a stabilizing and legitimizing force. Its involvement demonstrates that religious authority in early medieval Europe was inseparable from political power, and that those who controlled ritual and narrative could shape the destiny of dynasties. Moreover, the Church's alignment with functional power highlights the evolving concept of kingship. Early Merovingian rulers were defined by sacred blood and ceremonial presence. Later, authority became increasingly associated with the ability to govern effectively. The Church acted as an intermediary, bridging these two conceptions. It preserved the sacred narrative of the Merovingians while endorsing new forms of power that emphasized administration, military capability, and practical governance. This dual role helped facilitate a smooth transition and ensured that legitimacy remained intact even as authority shifted. Through its intervention, the Church also safeguarded its own position. By supporting capable rulers, whether symbolic kings or pragmatic mayors, it maintained influence over both secular and spiritual matters. Monasteries, churches, and ecclesiastical estates were protected, and clergy retained a voice in governance. In effect, the Church became both a partner and a power broker, shaping succession, policy, and historical memory. Its role illustrates how religious institutions could manipulate the interplay between sacred authority and practical governance to consolidate their own influence. Ultimately, the Church's involvement in the Merovingian decline demonstrates the inseparability of religion and politics in early medieval Europe. Sacred blood, ritual, and lineage provided symbolic authority, but effective governance required intermediaries and institutional oversight. The Church's ability to mediate this tension ensured stability, guided transitions, and preserved both legitimacy and order. By aligning with functional power, shaping narratives, and controlling ritual, it became a decisive actor in the redefinition of kingship and the eventual rise of the Carolingians. The lesson of this era is clear. Power is multifaceted, and authority relies not only on lineage or symbols, but on the ability to navigate complex networks of influence. The Merovingians' reliance on sacred blood initially ensured their dominance, but it also made them vulnerable when practical governance shifted into the hands of capable administrators. The Church, as both legitimizer and arbiter, exemplifies the ways in which religious institutions could shape political outcomes, preserve social order, and determine the destiny of dynasties, even one as sacred as the Merovingians. Through this lens, the decline of the Merovingians is not merely a story of weak kings or ambitious mayors. It is a story of shifting alliances, symbolic authority, and the profound influence of religious institutions. The Church's involvement transformed the balance of power, allowing sacred lineage to persist in memory while transferring practical control to those capable of exercising it. In doing so, it became a central architect of medieval politics, illustrating that the preservation and redirection of legitimacy can be as decisive as any battle or conquest. Even after the Merovingians had been stripped of political authority and their sacred kingship relegated to ritual, their legends refused to disappear. Across the countryside of Gaul, in monasteries and villages, and through the pages of cryptic manuscripts, stories of Merovingian kings persisted. These were tales of strange powers, sacred blood, and kings who were more than human, handed down in whispers and fragmentary records. Unlike official chronicles that framed later Merovingians as weak or ceremonial, these legends often emphasized mystery, wonder, and the enduring influence of their bloodline. They served as reminders that memory, belief, and myth can survive even when practical authority is erased. The endurance of Merovingian legend demonstrates the resilience of narrative as a form of power. While kings could be dethroned and their administrative control neutralized, the story of their sacred origins remained. In particular, the myth of Meroveca's sea-born ancestry continued to inspire awe and speculation. Was the dynasty truly touched by something otherworldly? Were their long hair, ritual behaviors, and perceived charisma signs of a power beyond the ordinary? Even without political control, these legends allowed the Merovingians to retain a form of symbolic authority, an invisible influence that persisted in memory and imagination. In rural communities, local traditions preserved fragments of these stories. Oral histories, sung in the fields or recited by traveling bards, recounted battles, miraculous victories, and the sacred lineage of the kings. These narratives were often inconsistent, overlapping with myth, folklore, and Christian reinterpretation. Yet they maintained a consistent theme. The Merovingians were extraordinary, chosen by forces beyond the visible world. Even in the absence of centralized power, the dynasty's mystique endured. In a society where literacy was limited, oral transmission was a potent tool for preserving authority across generations. Monasteries and religious centers also played a surprising role in maintaining these legends. While the church had facilitated the political neutralization of the Merovingians, clerics often preserved records of their lineage, rituals, and symbolic deeds. Manuscripts might include genealogies, liturgical references, or references to sacred relics connected to the dynasty. In some cases, chroniclers treated these legends with caution, noting their mysterious or ambiguous origins, yet the act of recording them ensured their survival. These written fragments became the foundation for later medieval interest in the Merovingians and their purportedly sacred blood. The persistence of Merovingian myths highlights the interplay between memory and power. Legends function as social tools. They reinforce norms, inspire loyalty, and create a shared sense of identity. In the case of the Merovingians, myths maintained the aura of sacred authority even when practical power had shifted. Peasants, nobles, and clergy could invoke the memory of the dynasty to validate local customs, rituals, or claims, linking present circumstances to a mythic past. In this way, the Merovingians remained influential, not through force, but through narrative and memory. Some legends emphasized the miraculous and supernatural. Tales recounted kings who healed through touch, commanded loyalty through charisma, or displayed prophetic insight. These stories reinforced the perception of the Merovingians as exceptional, embedding the idea that their authority derived from divine favor rather than mere political circumstance. Even when historians attempted to depict later kings as ceremonial or passive, these popular tales preserved an alternative memory, a dynasty imbued with power, mystery, and sacred significance. The symbolic resilience of the Merovingians also provided fertile ground for speculation and reinterpretation. In the centuries following their decline, rumors of hidden heirs, secret bloodlines, and preserved relics of power circulated throughout France and neighboring regions. Nobles and scholars speculated about surviving descendants who might wield influence in secret, often connecting them to contemporary struggles for legitimacy or territorial claims. This imaginative expansion of the dynasty's legacy demonstrates the enduring potency of myth as a social and political force. Interestingly, the persistence of these legends reflects a broader medieval worldview in which the past was alive, and memory carried authority. Unlike modern historical thinking, which prioritizes documents, dates, and facts, medieval societies often accepted stories as evidence of power and legitimacy. Sacred origins, miraculous deeds, and mysterious ancestry were treated as meaningful, shaping social hierarchies and political relationships. In this context, The Merovingians' ability to survive in legend underscores the sophistication of symbolic authority in a world where perception and memory were central to governance. The myths also bridged gaps between pagan and Christian traditions. While the dynasty had become Christianized, early stories of sea-born ancestors and mystical powers preserved echoes of older, pre-Christian beliefs. These hybrid narratives created a complex cultural tapestry, linking sacred bloodlines, divine favor, and historical memory. By incorporating elements of both pagan and Christian thought, the legends maintained relevance across generations, ensuring that the Merovingians remained embedded in the collective consciousness long after their political authority had faded. Furthermore, these surviving legends shaped later interpretations of European history. In the Renaissance and modern periods, scholars and writers looked back at Merovingian myths with fascination, often exaggerating their mysterious qualities. The idea of hidden bloodlines, sacred relics, and kings with otherworldly origins became central to a host of speculative histories and esoteric traditions. Even centuries after their fall, the Merovingians continued to inspire narratives of secrecy, continuity, and sacred inheritance, demonstrating the enduring influence of legend on both collective memory and cultural imagination. The survival of these myths also speaks to the power of narrative to challenge official history. While chroniclers and political actors sought to frame later Merovingians as weak or ceremonial, popular memory preserved an alternative story. This duality illustrates that even in societies with centralized authority, stories can endure outside the control of official records. Legends functioned as vessels for memory, belief, and identity, carrying fragments of authority long after practical power had been stripped away. In essence, the Merovingians' legends reveal the durability of symbolic power. Even after kingship became ceremonial, even after sacred hair was shorn and political authority transferred to mayors of the palace, the dynasty's influence persisted through story, ritual, and myth. Memory became a repository of authority, preserving the aura of sacred bloodlines and extraordinary kingship. The Merovingians survived not through armies or administration, but through the resilience of human imagination, cultural memory, and the enduring belief in the extraordinary. Ultimately, the persistence of Merovingian myths demonstrates that authority is multidimensional. Power is not solely exercised through governance or force. It can endure in narrative, ritual, and memory. Even as political structures change, the perception of legitimacy, reinforced through story and legend, can outlast temporal authority. The Merovingians' ability to survive in folklore, religious records, and local memory exemplifies this principle, revealing that myth, memory, and sacred symbolism are as integral to dynastic influence as any crown or army. In this way, the legends of the Merovingians refuse to die. They remind us that history is not merely a sequence of events, but a tapestry woven from belief, memory, and narrative. Even centuries after their fall, the dynasty's mystique persists, preserving the notion that sacred blood, mysterious origins, and extraordinary kings can shape collective imagination long after their temporal power has vanished. Centuries after the decline of the Merovingians, a remarkable theory emerged that would capture imaginations across Europe: the idea that their sacred bloodline might be connected to the very foundations of Christian history. This holy blood theory, as it would come to be called, proposed that the Merovingians were not merely kings of Gaul, but descendants of a lineage that carried divine significance, possibly even tracing back to Christ himself. While modern historians approach such claims with skepticism, the persistence of this belief illuminates both the enduring fascination with the Merovingians and the power of myth to intersect with history, religion, and identity. The roots of this theory lie in a combination of legend, symbolic authority, and historical ambiguity. From the earliest accounts, the Merovingians were presented as extraordinary, their legitimacy reinforced by sacred rituals, divine favor, and unusual origin stories. The myth of Merovingia's sea-born ancestry had already established a precedent. The dynasty was not fully of this world, or at least was perceived to be touched by forces beyond ordinary human experience. When combined with the later narratives of kings whose authority seemed ineffable and hereditary rather than earned, it was easy for subsequent generations to imagine connections that transcended the conventional boundaries of history. By the medieval period, certain chroniclers and genealogists began to speculate about hidden lineages and secret inheritances. The ambiguity surrounding the last Merovingians, particularly after Childeric III's deposition, provided fertile ground for speculation. If the dynasty had been removed from power but preserved in secrecy, could it be possible that its descendants carried a bloodline of exceptional significance? This question became the seed for a complex web of theories that combined history, theology, and legend. The Holy Blood theory gained further traction in the modern era through the work of historians, amateur researchers, and popular writers who were fascinated by the idea of hidden dynasties and secret knowledge. Some suggested that Merovingian bloodlines survived in obscurity, protected by religious institutions or secret societies, and that this lineage represented a divine inheritance meant to influence the course of European history. The combination of scarce records, legendary origins, and the mysterious nature of the last kings created a narrative in which speculation could flourish. Central to these theories was the intersection of sacred ancestry with divine mandate. If Merovingians were indeed descendants of a figure with supernatural or holy origins, their authority could not be fully erased, even by political force. Symbolic markers, like long hair and ceremonial rites, were interpreted as evidence of this sacred continuity. The tonsuring of Childeric III, for instance, was read not merely as a political act but as a ritual suppression of a line that carried inherent, almost mystical power. The symbolism reinforced the perception that the blood itself was potent, dangerous, and worth controlling. Part of the allure of the Holy Blood theory is psychological. Humans are naturally drawn to patterns, secret histories, and narratives that link the past to larger, transcendent meanings. The Merovingians, with their blend of myth, ritual, and historical presence, provide exactly such a narrative. Unlike dynasties whose origins are well documented and ordinary, the Merovingians offer ambiguity, mystery, and a connection to sacred or supernatural elements. This combination of traits ensures that the imagination continues to return to them centuries after their fall. The theory also intersects with religious and political themes. By suggesting a divine connection, the Merovingians were elevated from mere historical rulers to custodians of a sacred inheritance. Their lineage became a symbol of legitimacy beyond earthly governance, a conduit between human authority and divine will. This framing offers an explanation for why the church, political figures, and chroniclers might have taken extraordinary measures to control, suppress, or reinterpret their legacy. If the bloodline carried sacred significance, its management was not only a political necessity but also a spiritual imperative. Moreover, the Holy Blood theory reveals the enduring tension between visibility and secrecy in dynastic narratives. Throughout their history, the Merovingians were both celebrated and marginalized. Their rituals, sacred hair, and symbolic authority made them visible. Yet their political influence waned as practical power shifted to mayors of the palace. The notion of hidden descendants builds upon this duality. Even when removed from sight, the dynasty's influence could persist in secret, preserved in clandestine networks, monasteries, or obscure noble families. It is a continuation of a pattern established centuries earlier, when ritual and legend were inseparable from governance. The theory's persistence also illustrates how myths can evolve over time. What began as an origin story of a semi-divine ancestor transformed into broader speculation about Christ's bloodline and divine inheritance. This evolution reflects the adaptability of legend. As historical circumstances change, narratives expand, reinterpret, and gain new significance. The Merovingian sacred aura allowed them to transcend the limitations of their own era, becoming the focus of theological, historical, and esoteric inquiry long after they had ceased to govern. Importantly, the Holy Blood theory was never universally accepted. Skeptics argued that it relied on selective readings, ambiguous genealogies, and imaginative interpretations rather than concrete evidence. Yet its persistence is revealing. It demonstrates the power of myth to maintain relevance, the human desire to find continuity between sacred history and secular events, and the ability of legendary narratives to influence perception even in the face of empirical skepticism. The Merovingian story had become larger than their reign, a canvas onto which generations projected their hopes, fears, and ideas about legitimacy, lineage, and divine destiny. This intersection of myth, history, and speculation also highlights a key aspect of medieval and early modern thinking. The boundary between fact and legend was fluid. Chronicles mixed historical events with supernatural interpretation, genealogies intertwined truth and imagination, and the symbolic power of sacred lineage often outweighed practical governance. The holy blood theory can be understood as a continuation of this worldview, a modern reflection of how medieval people understood authority, ancestry, and the sacred. Ultimately, the holy blood theory reveals why the Merovingians continue to fascinate. They are a dynasty that occupies multiple planes simultaneously: historical and mythic, visible and hidden, sacred and political. Their blood, rituals, and legends persist as symbols of power that cannot be easily erased. Even in obscurity, they inspire speculation about legitimacy, divine favor, and hidden influence, showing that the impact of a dynasty extends beyond the temporal reach of kingship into the realm of imagination, narrative, and belief. The enduring fascination with the Merovingians, and the holy blood theory in particular, demonstrates a universal human impulse: the desire to connect the present to a sacred past, to find hidden continuity, and to believe in the extraordinary. Even centuries after their decline, the Merovingians continue to cast a long shadow over European history and imagination, reminding us that myth, lineage, and the power of story often outlive the authority of kings themselves. The fascination with Merovingian bloodlines is not purely the product of modern imagination. It is rooted in centuries of speculation, rumor, and symbolic significance. Beyond the legends of sacred ancestry, later writers and chroniclers began to explore the possibility that the dynasty had survived in secret, preserved through hidden heirs and clandestine marriages. These narratives emerged from the enduring ambiguity surrounding the later Merovingians and the cultural obsession with sacred lineage. They suggest a lineage that could not be destroyed by politics, ritual, or history, hinting at a power that persisted quietly beneath the surface of European society. The concept of hidden descendants arises naturally from the Merovingians' history. Even as Childeric III was dethroned and tonsured, the physical survival of the bloodline was possible. Monasteries, remote estates, and obscure noble families could serve as refuges, preserving both life and lineage. This potential continuity made the dynasty a subject of speculation and fascination. If the sacred bloodline still existed, it could be claimed, revered, or feared. The very uncertainty of survival imbued the Merovingians with an enduring aura of mystery, blurring the lines between myth and historical possibility. Stories of hidden heirs also reinforced the idea that the Merovingians' authority was inherent rather than conferred. Sacred blood, it was believed, carried power independent of political structures or administrative control. Even if kings were dethroned or neutralized, their descendants could retain the potential to influence events or reclaim authority. This notion transformed the dynasty from a set of rulers into a living symbol of continuity, an almost magical force capable of persisting despite centuries of upheaval. In essence, the Merovingians' power became as much metaphysical as it was temporal. These speculative narratives often intersected with themes of secrecy and protection. Hidden heirs were imagined as being safeguarded by loyal followers, religious institutions, or isolated communities. The church, which had played a role in neutralizing Merovingian political power, is sometimes cast in these stories as both a protector and a manipulator of the sacred bloodline. Monasteries could serve dual roles, hiding potential heirs while simultaneously controlling their access to authority. This duality underscores the complexity of medieval governance, where religious institutions were both custodians of sacred lineage and arbiters of political legitimacy. The legends also reflect the psychological appeal of secrecy. A hidden bloodline offers a sense of continuity and hope, a reminder that divine or extraordinary authority may yet endure. It plays upon the human fascination with the concealed, the forbidden, and the sacred. These narratives persisted because they resonated with cultural and emotional values. The idea that power and sanctity cannot be entirely eradicated, that even in obscurity, legitimacy and influence survive. The Merovingians, stripped of political control, became ideal vessels for these enduring fantasies. The idea of clandestine survival also allowed for reinterpretations of historical events. Political shifts that might have seemed definitive, such as the deposition of Childeric III, could be reframed as tactical measures rather than absolute endings. The dynasty's supposed continuation in secret implied that the struggle for legitimacy was ongoing, a subterranean tension beneath the surface of European politics. This reinterpretation gave historical continuity a sense of suspense and mystery, inviting later generations to imagine the dynasty's influence extending far beyond its visible reign. These narratives often included coded signs, cryptic genealogies, and allegorical references, reflecting a medieval tendency to encode knowledge for those in the know. Hidden descendants were rarely documented overtly. Instead, their existence was suggested through symbolic markers, ritual practices, or ambiguous historical records. This pattern mirrors the Merovingians' own approach to power: subtle, symbolic, and dependent on perception rather than brute force alone. Even in speculation, the dynasty's legacy remained consistent with its historical character: mysterious, sacred, and enduring. The persistence of these ideas also demonstrates the adaptability of Merovingian mythology. As political circumstances changed, as the Carolingians consolidated power, and as European society evolved, the narratives transformed to suit contemporary anxieties and desires. Hidden heirs could serve as symbols of resistance, legitimacy, or divine favor, depending on the needs of storytellers or political actors. This flexibility ensured that Merovingian influence remained culturally potent even after practical authority had vanished. Moreover, these stories underscore the enduring human desire to link the present with a sacred past. The notion of hidden Merovingian heirs suggests that extraordinary power, divine favor, and legitimacy are not confined to the visible world. By imagining secret lineages, societies could maintain a sense of connection to historical continuity, divine order, and the extraordinary. This reflects a deeply ingrained medieval worldview in which ancestry, bloodline, and sacred authority were inseparable from temporal governance. The fascination with hidden bloodlines also feeds into modern interpretations and conspiracies. Later centuries would expand on the idea, connecting the Merovingians to secret societies, mystical knowledge, and even religious relics. While such theories are often speculative, they highlight the enduring impact of the Merovingians on European imagination. The dynasty's combination of historical presence, ritual significance, and legendary origin made it uniquely suited to these narratives, allowing it to survive in collective memory long after its political power had disappeared. In examining these stories, one sees a pattern. The Merovingians became more than a dynasty. They became a symbol of the persistence of sacred authority. Hidden heirs, secret bloodlines, and clandestine survival were metaphors for the resilience of legitimacy, illustrating that authority rooted in ritual and lineage cannot be fully destroyed by political expediency. Even as kings were dethroned and symbolic power diminished, the dynasty's influence endured in the realm of imagination, memory, and speculation. Ultimately, the narratives of hidden Merovingian descendants remind us that power is not solely defined by governance or military might. Authority can persist through myth, ritual, and the perception of sacred continuity. The idea of hidden heirs demonstrates that even a dynasty neutralized politically can remain potent culturally, symbolically, and psychologically. In the case of the Merovingians, the survival of legend and the belief in clandestine continuity ensures that the dynasty's shadow stretches far beyond the historical record, preserving its mystique for centuries to come. The concept of hidden Merovingian heirs thus embodies the enduring tension between visibility and influence. Political authority may be stripped, ritual may be curtailed, and public presence erased. Yet the symbolic resonance of sacred blood can persist invisibly. The dynasty's survival in legend reflects the power of memory and narrative to maintain authority beyond the reach of temporal structures, highlighting the remarkable durability of sacred lineage in human imagination and historical consciousness. The enduring allure of the Merovingians is inseparable from the strange, almost supernatural qualities attributed to them throughout history. Beyond sacred hair, ceremonial rites, and legendary ancestry, later narratives imbued the dynasty with mystical abilities and unexplained powers. Kings were described as possessing uncanny charisma, prophetic insight, and even the ability to influence events through will alone. Whether these accounts reflect exaggeration, myth-making, or a genuine belief in extraordinary qualities, they reveal the ways in which perception and legend can amplify the authority of a bloodline long after its political power has waned. One of the most persistent elements of this mystique is the idea of sacred touch. Chroniclers, particularly in the medieval period, suggested that Merovingian kings could confer blessings, healing, or protection simply by their presence. These stories often describe kings curing the sick, calming feuds, or ensuring the fertility of lands and livestock. While modern observers may dismiss these claims as fanciful, in a society where the line between divine intervention and earthly authority was fluid, such abilities reinforced the perception that the Merovingians were not ordinary rulers. Their sacred blood was thought to carry tangible power, a force that transcended ordinary politics and even law. This perception was reinforced by ritual and symbolism. The king's long hair, their coronations, and their participation in religious ceremonies all served as visible signs of extraordinary power. Each ritual was not merely a tradition but a demonstration of latent authority, a signal to subjects and nobles that the Merovingians were chosen, protected, and blessed. Even when political influence waned, the combination of ceremonial visibility and legend ensured that their aura persisted. In essence, the Merovingians' mystique operated independently of military victories or administrative control. Authority could be perceived, even in the absence of action. Legends also highlight the dynastic obsession with continuity and secrecy. Tales of hidden descendants, clandestine marriages, and preserved bloodlines suggest that the Merovingians' influence might persist, even when kingship itself was neutralized. These stories often feature heirs who are kept safe by loyal followers or hidden in remote monasteries, awaiting a time when their sacred lineage might be restored to power. The imagery reinforces the idea that their authority is both enduring and untouchable, embedded in blood and destiny rather than contingent on immediate political circumstances. Prophetic qualities are another recurring theme. Some accounts suggest that Merovingian kings had insight into future events, able to predict outcomes of battles, succession disputes, or natural disasters. This ability to see beyond the ordinary world contributed to their aura of otherness. Prophecy was not merely superstition, it was a form of social authority. A king believed to possess foresight could command obedience, shape alliances, and influence behavior without issuing formal orders. Such accounts underscore the symbolic power of the dynasty, demonstrating that influence in early medieval Europe was as much about perception as action. The persistence of these mystical narratives also reflects the intersection of pagan and Christian traditions. While the Merovingians were Christianized early in their history, many stories retained echoes of pre-Christian beliefs. Seaborne ancestry, divine favor, and mystical powers linked the dynasty to older mythologies, suggesting that their authority transcended any single religious framework. These blended narratives ensured that the Merovingians remained culturally resonant, even as the social, political, and religious landscapes evolved. Their power was encoded not just in rule but in memory, myth, and ritual. The mystical qualities attributed to the Merovingians also had practical political implications. Legends of sacred power discouraged rebellion, reinforced loyalty, and legitimized authority even in the absence of tangible governance. A king perceived as supernatural or divinely favored could command respect that ordinary rulers could not. This perception maintained social cohesion, reduced challenges from nobles, and reinforced the centrality of the dynasty in collective memory. Symbolic authority, in this case, was as effective as administrative power in sustaining influence. Moreover, the mystique of the Merovingians inspired fascination in later centuries. The combination of sacred blood, ritualized kingship, and hidden power created fertile ground for speculation, conspiracy, and storytelling. From the Renaissance to modern popular culture, the dynasty was frequently cast as a repository of secret knowledge, mystical abilities, or divine inheritance. These interpretations often drew on the medieval imagination, extrapolating from ritual, legend, and symbolic authority to create narratives in which the Merovingians continued to wield invisible power across generations. The idea of sacred or mystical power also reflects a fundamental human tendency to encode authority in symbolic and extraordinary terms. The Merovingians' perceived abilities transformed them from mere political figures into symbols of divine order and continuity. Their legends illustrate how belief, ritual, and narrative can sustain authority even when formal structures fail. The dynasty's influence, therefore, was not purely historical. It was cultural, psychological, and symbolic, enduring far beyond the lifespans of individual kings. These mystical narratives intersect with broader medieval concepts of kingship. Authority was understood not solely as military or administrative competence, but as a combination of sacred lineage, ritual observance, and social perception. Kings were expected to embody divine favor, act as mediators between heaven and earth, and serve as moral exemplars. In this context, the Merovingians' legendary powers were a natural extension of the expectations placed upon rulers, magnified by the dynasty's symbolic and ceremonial prominence. The stories of the Merovingians' extraordinary abilities also underscore the interplay between myth and political memory. Even when kings were politically marginalized, their sacred aura provided a form of influence that could not be directly suppressed. Ritual, legend, and belief functioned as invisible tools of authority, maintaining continuity and reverence even as practical governance shifted elsewhere. In essence, mystical narratives ensured that the dynasty remained culturally potent long after its political relevance had waned. Ultimately, the mystique of the Merovingians demonstrates that authority can exist independently of temporal power. Sacred blood, ritual performance, and legendary abilities created a form of influence that persisted through memory, perception, and belief. Even in obscurity, kings could shape behavior, inspire loyalty, and maintain symbolic authority. The dynasty's survival in legend illustrates that power is multidimensional, encompassing not only administration and conquest but also ritual, myth, and psychological presence. The enduring fascination with the Merovingians' mystical qualities reminds us that history is as much about perception as events. Their sacred powers, prophetic insight, and ceremonial prominence were instruments of social control and cultural influence, amplifying their authority far beyond what might be measured in battles or decrees. In the broader story of the dynasty, these narratives ensure that the Merovingians remain more than historical rulers. They endure as symbols of sacred authority, mystical influence, and the enduring power of legend itself. The legacy of the Merovingians is as much a story of perception as it is of bloodlines, battles, or political maneuvering. Centuries after their deposition, the dynasty continued to inspire fascination, speculation, and even reverence. One of the most enduring aspects of this legacy is the idea that the Merovingians, though politically neutralized, wielded influence far beyond the visible structures of kingship. Through legend, ritual, and symbolic power, the dynasty became a template for understanding authority, continuity, and the mystical dimensions of leadership. Even in historical memory, the Merovingians occupied a unique space. While later rulers such as the Carolingians consolidated practical authority and exercised control over armies, lands, and administration, the Merovingians were remembered as sacred figures, embodiments of a divine or exceptional lineage. Their long hair, ceremonial rites, and mythic origins were not merely decorative. They were symbols of enduring legitimacy. In a society that revered ancestry and ritual, the Merovingians' presence in memory was almost as powerful as their rule in practice. They existed simultaneously as history and myth, tangible and intangible, real and symbolic. The endurance of the Merovingians in legend is partly a consequence of their mysterious origins. The story of Merovec, born of a union with a sea creature, established the dynasty as extraordinary from its inception. This ambiguity allowed generations of chroniclers, clerics, and storytellers to interpret the line in multiple ways. Even when political power shifted to the mayors of the palace, the sacred bloodline remained a source of symbolic authority. The ambiguity surrounding their origin transformed the dynasty into a vessel for imagination, speculation, and esoteric interpretation, ensuring that the Merovingians remained culturally potent long after they ceased to govern. Symbolism played a central role in sustaining the dynasty's influence. Rituals surrounding kingship, coronations, the presentation of sacred relics, and ceremonial public appearances reinforced the perception of divine favor. Even passive or ceremonial kings projected legitimacy. Observers, from peasants to nobles, interpreted these actions as evidence of sanctity, linking authority to lineage and ritual rather than mere administrative competence. The Merovingians' power, therefore, transcended the material. It was encoded in perception, performance, and belief. Legends of the dynasty also highlight the interplay between visibility and secrecy. While kings may have been publicly dethroned or neutralized, stories of hidden heirs, secret bloodlines, and clandestine survival suggest that the Merovingians continued to exert influence beneath the surface. These narratives reinforce the idea that authority and legitimacy were resilient, capable of persisting even in the absence of official power. The possibility of hidden continuity imbued the dynasty with a form of enduring authority, a sense that the sacred bloodline could never be fully erased. This concept of concealed influence intersects with religious and political structures. Monasteries, abbeys, and loyal clerics were often imagined as guardians of the dynasty, preserving knowledge, records, and even potential heirs. The church, which had initially sanctioned the Carolingian takeover, also served as the keeper of Merovingian memory, safeguarding the symbolic authority of the bloodline. This duality underscores the complex relationship between ritual, religion, and politics. Institutions that neutralized practical power could simultaneously preserve symbolic influence. The mystical aspects of the Merovingians further amplified their legacy. Chroniclers described kings with prophetic insight, the ability to bless or heal, and other extraordinary qualities. While modern audiences may interpret these accounts as legend, in the medieval imagination they reinforced the sacred aura of the dynasty. Mystical attributes provided justification for obedience, inspired awe, and maintained loyalty. The combination of ritual, lineage, and supernatural perception ensured that Merovingians remained powerful cultural figures, even when they lacked tangible authority. The persistence of these narratives demonstrates the enduring human fascination with continuity, secrecy, and sacred bloodlines. Stories of hidden descendants or surviving heirs resonated with a sense of destiny, divine order, and historical inevitability. Even in periods when the Merovingians were politically irrelevant, these tales maintained the dynasty's symbolic relevance. Authority was thus transformed from tangible governance into cultural memory, ritualized perception, and the imagination of communities across Europe. The enduring fascination with Merovingians also illustrates the malleability of myth. Over time, legends evolved to reflect the values, anxieties, and aspirations of different eras. In some cases, the dynasty was linked to secret knowledge, mystical relics, or esoteric wisdom. In others, Merovingian bloodlines were imagined as a source of divine or extraordinary authority, capable of influencing events long after their kings had fallen. These evolving interpretations demonstrate how myth can sustain influence independently of material power, shaping cultural memory and collective imagination. Furthermore, the Merovingians' legacy highlights the intersection of sacred authority and historical narrative. Chroniclers often emphasized symbolic weakness in later kings to justify political transitions, yet simultaneously preserved their sacred lineage, ceremonial rituals, and extraordinary ancestry. This dual narrative allowed the dynasty to remain central to the medieval imagination. They were simultaneously obsolete rulers and sacred ancestors, ceremonial kings and mystical archetypes. The tension between historical reality and mythic perception ensured the dynasty's continued cultural relevance. The dynasty's influence extended beyond legend into the politics and imagination of later centuries. In Europe, writers, historians, and even conspiracy theorists drew upon Merovingian mythology to construct narratives of hidden power, divine blood, and secret continuity. The symbolic potency of the dynasty provided a framework for exploring themes of legitimacy, authority, and destiny, illustrating the lasting impact of a lineage that combined historical reality with mythic resonance. Ultimately, The Merovingians' enduring influence demonstrates that authority is multidimensional. Power does not exist solely in political structures, armies, or law. It also resides in memory, ritual, perception, and narrative. The dynasty's sacred bloodline, ceremonial visibility, and legendary qualities allowed it to persist culturally and symbolically long after practical governance had passed to others. Even in obscurity, the Merovingians retained a form of influence, shaping imagination, inspiring loyalty, and preserving the idea that sacred authority can transcend temporal power. The story of the Merovingians reminds us that legacy is as much about perception and memory as it is about tangible achievements. By encoding authority in blood, ritual, and legend, the dynasty ensured that its influence would outlast its political relevance. Their ability to persist in cultural imagination demonstrates the enduring power of symbolic authority, the resilience of myth, and the subtle, often invisible ways in which a dynasty can shape history long after its formal reign has ended. In this way, the Merovingians became more than historical rulers. They became icons of sacred lineage, mystical power, and enduring authority. Their legacy teaches that influence can survive in the imagination, that legitimacy can endure through ritual and narrative, and that the power of a dynasty is not measured solely by armies or decrees, but by the stories, symbols, and beliefs it leaves behind. The enduring fascination with the Merovingians is inseparable from the idea that their influence extended beyond politics and into the realm of secrecy and esoteric knowledge. Over the centuries, the dynasty has been portrayed not merely as rulers of a kingdom, but as custodians of hidden wisdom, guardians of sacred relics, and possessors of mystical insight. This narrative, while speculative, reflects the deep cultural resonance of the dynasty and its ability to inspire stories that intertwine history, legend, and the imagination of generations. Even after their political power waned, the Merovingians were never entirely forgotten, and their supposed secrets became a potent symbol of authority and mystery. From the earliest accounts, the Merovingians were seen as extraordinary. Meroveca's semi-mythical conception and Clovis' divine baptism set a precedent for the dynasty as both sacred and exceptional. Later chroniclers and storytellers expanded upon this aura, emphasizing the mystical dimensions of the line. Kings were not merely sovereigns. They were vessels of a sacred force, capable of influencing fate, guiding divine will, and acting as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Their long hair, ritual coronations, and sacred blood were more than symbols. They were perceived as conduits of supernatural authority, visible manifestations of a lineage that transcended ordinary human power. This mystique naturally led to speculation about hidden knowledge. As the Merovingians' political authority diminished, chroniclers and later interpreters wondered what the dynasty might have preserved beyond its visible reign. Were there sacred texts, secret teachings, or esoteric wisdom passed down within the family? Could their bloodline confer more than ceremonial legitimacy? These questions became the foundation for a growing body of legends that connected the dynasty to hidden power, implying that the Merovingians retained influence even when removed from the throne. Part of this fascination lies in the ambiguity of history itself. Records of the later Merovingians are sparse, fragmentary, and often contradictory. Kings who were dethroned, exiled, or tonsured left behind only ceremonial traces, genealogical records, and scattered anecdotes. This scarcity created a vacuum in which imagination could flourish. When historical certainty is limited, myth becomes a tool for interpretation. The gaps in knowledge surrounding the dynasty encouraged speculation, allowing generations to project ideas of secret wisdom, mystical bloodlines, and hidden influence onto a family whose visible power had vanished. These narratives often portrayed the Merovingians as custodians of knowledge that could shape the destiny of Europe. Tales of hidden heirs, preserved relics, and secret rites suggest that the dynasty's authority was not limited to kingship, but extended into spiritual and cultural domains. Their sacred blood was imagined as a source of continuity, capable of influencing events behind the scenes. Even in stories of deposition and exile, the dynasty retained the potential to act, to assert legitimacy, and to reclaim influence in ways that were both symbolic and practical. The theme of secrecy is central to these legends. Hidden descendants were imagined as living in monasteries, remote estates, or protective enclaves, shielded from political interference. These heirs were often described as possessing knowledge or powers that had been preserved for generations, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Such narratives highlight the tension between visibility and influence. Even when stripped of ceremonial authority, the dynasty could exert symbolic and cultural power through the persistence of memory, myth, and sacred inheritance. This mystique also reflects broader medieval understandings of authority. Power was rarely understood solely in terms of military might or administration. Legitimacy was intertwined with perception, ritual, and spiritual resonance. A dynasty that carried sacred blood, preserved rituals, and maintained its legendary narrative could influence society without ruling directly. The Merovingians exemplify this principle. Their symbolic authority and the stories surrounding them were sufficient to shape behavior, command loyalty, and inspire awe, even in the absence of political control. The association with hidden knowledge also allowed later writers and thinkers to reinterpret the dynasty in ways that aligned with contemporary interests. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, speculation about secret bloodlines, mystical powers, and hidden influence became popular, blending historical curiosity with esoteric and philosophical inquiry. The Merovingians became a canvas upon which ideas about divine legitimacy, secret wisdom, and historical destiny could be projected. This adaptability ensured that their mystique persisted across centuries, transcending both geography and political circumstance. Furthermore, the notion of secrecy amplified the aura of the dynasty. Kings who were removed from power were no longer publicly visible, but their supposed hidden knowledge suggested that authority remained latent, waiting to be realized. This created a tension between apparent weakness and invisible potency, enhancing the dynasty's mystique. Even in obscurity, the Merovingians were perceived as capable of shaping events, guiding moral order, or preserving sacred knowledge, emphasizing the enduring potency of symbolic authority. The legends also highlight the interplay between myth and memory. Chroniclers, clerics, and storytellers contributed to a layered understanding of the dynasty, mixing historical fact with interpretation, ritual, and imagination. Over time, these narratives became self-reinforcing. The more the Merovingians were removed from political power, the more compelling became the idea that they retained hidden influence. This process demonstrates the durability of legend and its ability to shape perceptions of authority long after formal governance has ended. Even today, the fascination with Merovingian secrecy endures. Tales of hidden heirs, preserved relics, and esoteric knowledge continue to captivate scholars, writers, and popular audiences. The dynasty serves as a symbol of continuity, sacred power, and hidden authority, illustrating how myth and memory can extend the influence of a family far beyond its temporal reign. Their story demonstrates that legitimacy is not only about visibility or military might, but also about perception, narrative, and the persistence of belief. Ultimately, the Merovingians' association with hidden knowledge underscores the multidimensional nature of power. Authority is not confined to armies, law, or administration. It can survive in legend, ritual, and imagination. Even as kingship became ceremonial and practical control shifted elsewhere, the dynasty retained symbolic influence through narrative, sacred lineage, and the possibility of secret continuity. The idea that the Merovingians preserved hidden wisdom ensures that their story remains alive, not only as history but as a framework for understanding how power, memory, and myth intersect. The legacy of the Merovingians reminds us that influence is not solely exercised through visible control. Symbolism, perception, and narrative can maintain authority across generations. In the case of the Merovingians, legends of hidden heirs and preserved knowledge illustrate how a dynasty's mystique can endure, shaping imagination, culture, and belief long after its political reign has ended. Their story is a testament to the resilience of symbolic power, the allure of secrecy, and the enduring capacity of myth to sustain the memory of extraordinary authority.